All right, well, good morning, everyone. So we're going to go ahead and record today's 2020 session because the weather is preventing us from getting a lot of folks here in that. So, but today is really, again, about just getting you guys comfortable with your screens and really going through the operation side of things. So I know we're a little lighter class here and we are recording this, but we will be running the Gen 2 on the screen over there. Close that down there. All right. So we will be having the Gen 2 and Gen 1 kind of information on the screen over to your guys' left, and then I'll be having the Gen 3 pretty much on this big screen here, and I'll jump back and forth between here and the PowerPoint. So, you know, really want to make sure this clinic is for you guys, and so anything that you want to hear for sure or want me to go through in more detail on that, make sure you let us know. But really the goal today is getting you comfortable with things. So as we see little hiccups and things taking place in the field, that we're able to maximize our yield, right? We think of putting all your population in the field and trying to get your maximum return for every seed placed in there. And so really becomes about data driving decisions. So as things are taking place, as you're planting, you get that information, you stop, you make changes, and we maximize that equipment that you guys have invested with us. So kind of starting off for this spring, for 2023 planting season, this is the software breakdown that we should have. We want everybody to be running 2023.0.0. That's going to be most systems on a Gen 3 system. Okay, Gen 2s, we haven't had any updates since the year 2020, so 2020.0.1 on your classic screen. If you hit the setup button just once on the side here, it is going to tell you what version you are running. My projector's just slightly cutting off my screen here, but you can see here it shows what version. Okay, we go down, if you're running a Gen 1, our last software update was in 2017, so 2017.4 is the most current for Gen 1 users. If you're using FieldView with your 2020, you want to have your Apple, Apple operating system at least 14 or higher. In fact, I will just jump my iPad online here real quick, and we'll just walk through real quickly on the iPad a few little notes to kind of consider with that. So let's switch this around. The other thing is on FieldView itself, the current version is 12.0.0 as of March 8th. I was told there is an update possibly coming on that as well. Let's just go ahead and get this screen up and going here. So I'm going to switch this screen here to an iPad real quick. And when we talking through on the iPad itself, if you go to the little set of gears over here, that's going to be your general settings. And underneath your general settings here, you'll see an About. If you click on the About side of things, it's going to say what version of software. It's probably hard to see there. It's kind of small like that there. But 16.3.1 is what's currently out there. We said we need to have 14 or higher to get the latest version of FieldView. If you can get to 16, that's great. Okay, the other thing to notice, as long as I'm in here, if I scroll down a little bit, is what's the capacity of my iPad. This one's a 128, and it looks like I've got almost 70 gig available, so I've got plenty of space for my iPad to run FieldView for this next year. Okay, I guess I'd like to see about 32 gigabyte of data as free space roughly, just to ensure that we've got good information or good room to store all your information. Okay. So I'm going to back, if you need to do an update, I backed out a spot, there is software update. If you're at a lower number than 14 and you go to do software update and it says that you are all the way up to date, that probably means that your iPad has reached its maximum life. Apple's no longer supporting it. If it says there's an update available, make sure you got good signal. We're a little limited on signal in here today, so we won't be able to update in here. But again, get your iPad to iOS 16 if you can. If you can at least get to 14, you should be able to run the current version of FieldView. As long as we are talking FieldView and I got the iPad up, I back out of here. When we connect either to a Gen 1 through a Gen 3, we are going to talk about this gray button with the black F, the cab app. When you open him up, You should see the field view, climate field view pop up on here, your usernames here. Nothing has really changed too much as far as how this guy works. If we want to know what version we're on, you click on the help, the life preserver there. And if you notice on the side here, there is a version information. So I click on that. It does show that I am on version 12 right now. And it breaks down all the different updates that they've had on there. I'm going to back up to that support button as long as I'm in here. You know, when it comes to equipment with the precision side of things, right, your premier dealer is where we want your first phone call to go to. But in the case of they say, hey, you know, we need a little more information, can you help us put a ticket in? What we're asking for is say, hey, go ahead and punch a phone number in, and when it's going to ask on the product, if it's an iPad issue or something with field view, you probably want to get a hold of the climate team. That's the first one there. But if it's on the precision side of things, you go Precision Planning 2020, describe your problem. Folks, it always helps if you put a little bit more information in there, then it just doesn't work, okay? If you can kind of give us a little more breakdown as far as, hey, what model planner do you got? What equipment are you having a problem with and that? And if you're running a Gen 1 or Gen 2, when you hit submit ticket, it's going to take the data from that Gen 1 or Gen 2 and assign it with it. Okay, on the Gen 3, it's a little bit different. The way the program is written is different. It's a different language, so we can't run that through FieldView into our ticket system that way. We'll talk a little bit about that later on the Gen 3 for those of you that have Gen 3s. Okay? So with that, I'll jump out of there. The other thing I get some questions on at times is, hey, how do I know everything's plugged in, or maybe had a little bit of issue when it plugs in? So right now I'm not plugged in, and so you notice up on the top here there's no lightning bolt or anything. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click on the map button. And granted, it took me to our home farm, our last yield piece that we did, but I'm going to go ahead and plug in my iPad to the 2020, and it should jump to a planter. If it does not go to a planter and I don't see the lightning bolt in the corner here, we've not made good connection with it. Okay, so it is showing me my hybrid and such. At this point in time, it's going to get its GPS from the screen. My screen doesn't have any GPS functioning in it. That's why I just took us to out in the field like that. All right, now if it doesn't do this, one of the things you can do, if it does not connect, first of all, let's just talk about the health of these cords. You know, if you're like in our house, our cords don't last forever. We got quite a few Apple devices at our place, and it seems like we're always buying cords. Don't be taking that 6-foot long cable that you maybe have to plug your phone in at your nightstand. Use a little bit shorter one, okay? Just long enough to get to connect there, and make sure it's a better quality one. Don't just get the cheapest one you can find online. The cable does make a difference on how they charge. The iPads do. Apple does restrict how much power they can take in internally, so that is also sometimes a restriction. So if you're worried about, you know, when you go to the field, make sure your iPad's all the way charged before you start. If it still seems like your battery's going the wrong direction even though it's charging, one of the things you can do is kind of swap your finger down, take your brightness. Okay, it's not going to change the projector, but if you can drop your brightness down and turn off some of the other apps in the background so you're not using as much power, that's going to definitely help preserve the life of your battery on your iPad. Okay? If you're still not able to get things to connect, you may have to restart the iPad. So if I were to disconnect from here, you're going to hit, there's a button on top by your camera, and then you've got the home button. If you hold those two down long enough, your screen will go black. If you keep hanging on a little bit longer, you're going to get the white Apple logo pop back on. That's doing a reboot of the iPad. Generally, 9 times out of 10, if you do that and it fires back up, then when you plug back in, you should see things connect. You don't have to have it unplugged when you do that. I like to do that though. I'd like to unplug it and let the system reset before plugging it back in again. Make sure the iPad's healthy, unlock it, make sure all the other apps are off. Open your app back up, plug it back in. You can see here, I did get the planner that showed back up again. Now, you will every once in a while, I haven't seen it on the Gen 3s as much, but I've seen it more on the Gen 1 or Gen 2s. Like if I get in the cab and I slide my butt across the seat, I might cause a little static electricity, and when I grab my monitor, I might accidentally get a little static zap with my screen. You could reset the breaker on the USB port on the Gen 1 or Gen 2s, so then you may have to actually power cycle your Gen 1 or Gen 2, bring that back on to plug it in and get it happy. Okay? So that's probably as much time as I'm going to spend on FieldView and the iPad for today. Let's go ahead and switch this back. I will, for those of you that are running a Gen 1 or Gen 2, if we do have on the screen here and we go to the diagnose button and we notice things, now I am still connected, so you notice the iPad is green, FieldView module is green, and display is green. So if I go ahead and back out of FieldView completely, you'll notice it turned yellow. Now, iPad is here. That means it is connected and knows we are connected to the iPad, but the app is off. Now, if I disconnect the iPad from the 2020, notice the iPad drops off completely. Now, the FieldView module is still green because on a Gen 2, that's built in. Okay? On a Gen 3, you've got the extra module and stuff to bring that information across. All right? Okay, so I think with that, I'm going to set the iPad off to the side. So some other resources to consider. You know, we're going through and getting you guys refreshed on how to operate things today, but here are some other resources for you to consider. cloud.precisionplanning.com. Once you go there, the third button over, I apologize, we don't have working internet in here today, but there'll be a resource guide where you can click on, and all the products we have are in there. There's install guides, there are operation guides, other video clips on things. Great resource for you guys to have. 2020.ag, that is just for those of you with Gen 3s. It talks through all the software bits about it. If you're not updated to 2023.0.0, when you go to 2020.ag, that is where you can actually download that software onto a thumb drive and then place it into your Gen 3 and do the software update. Okay? Now today we're not going to talk about maintenance, but if you do want some tips on going through that planner before spring hits here, go ahead and go to precisionplanning.com/maintenance, and we have we've got a cataloged, multi-step process of areas to take a look at that planner, make sure it's in tip-top shape before you hit the field. Some videos going through some of the different areas. In fact, we will actually show a snippet from that when we get to our downforce discussion here later today. While you're there, you'll also notice along the side, once you're logged in there, an opportunity to get to our Emergence Matters portion of things. So you see here is precisionplanning.com/emergence matters, which will also take you there. And that talks about things like why does emergence matter on the yield side. And then also you can sign up and we will send you flag kits so you can do your own emergence study on your own farm and do some flagging and check and see just how well are you able to achieve good even emergence. Also there you'll see inside PTI.com, PTI Farm, the Planner and Technology Institute. That is our research farm in Pontiac, Illinois. Jason Webster heads that up, does a fantastic job. If you'd like to get some of the snippets from all the research he's done, if you go to InsidePTI.com, you put your name and your email in, and we're on season 4 now of some of the studies where Jason just puts together some nice short little video clips explaining some of the research he's done, and it'll hit your email inbox about twice a week. You'll get little video clips and kind of watch and see what we've been doing down there. And then again, if you're doing some of the stuff with FieldView and that, climate.com to get more information on things with FieldView. Okay, we mentioned already about iPads. These are ones that are compatible with FieldView for this year. If they can handle, again, we said the iOS 14 and up. A big long list of names here, nothing to be too concerned about. If you go to your iPad, like I said, and you go to update, that's going to tell you if you can get to the most current version. All right, so with that, as we dive in here a little bit, those of you with Gen 3s, we've got our main screen here. Again, we've got the two running off to your left-hand side there. Just a little bit about the difference here. So on a Gen 2, right, we've got the brains and the display together. When we went to the Gen 3, we broke it apart into two pieces. So we've got the screen that we're used to, we've got the switch box, what we call the CCM, okay, and then we've got the DBM, the brains of the thing. So that's going to be a box that looks like this here. And you can't really plug anything in incorrectly here. We've got our power, we've got our implement can, we got our GPS and radar. Now there's two Ethernet plugs over here. Those are interchangeable, but that's going to talk to either your display like we showcased here, all right, or you could put a second display in, or your field view module, okay, which is going to talk to then and plug into your iPad, right? So you can have those intertwined. A little quick note on that, on those cables, that is a little bit finer wire on those cables. So make sure that as you guys are putting your stuff back in there, watch to make sure they don't get caught in your machine at all, or when you zip tie those wires in the cab, try not to crush them and make sure those cables are in good shape, because that is what is providing that display its power and function like that, okay? So if you do have any kind of hiccups, that's going to be one of the main first things we take a look at. Are these cables in good shape? Are there any damage to them? So just be kind of careful as you're weaving that and getting those set up in your cab, okay? Now, when it comes to troubleshooting or understanding the system, there is a power button, right? A recessed power button in there. Both the Gen 1 and 2s and 3s, when we plug in, we have that 3-pin system. There is a ground, there is a constant power, and there is a switch power, okay? So, ideally, when you have your power button pressed in on the Gen 3 and you turn the key, that's going to start the initiation process and firing the system up. On the Gen 1s, that rocker switch could stay on and you would go ahead, turn the key on, it would fire up. On the Gen 2s, however, there's the recess button, so you're going to have to hit that after you fire up. On the Gen 3s, that power sequence, when it starts up like that, we got to be a little bit careful when we start the tractor. If I turn the key on and it's in the middle of the boot up phase and I wait a little bit and then I go ahead and crank the tractor up, it's possible that when we crank that tractor up that it's going to draw the power down and we could give a couple little hiccups at times. We might goof up the boot sequence. So a good rule of thumb is when I go to start the tractor is I grab that key and I start all the way right away. Now, if you're going to have somebody else come out, maybe you have a technician from the tractor manufacturer that's going to work on your GPS or something on the cab, especially for those of you with the Gen 3, I would say hit that power button on the DBM, leave it off, because a lot of times they're going to be turning that key on and off a bunch as they're power cycling, maybe getting that globe updated or doing stuff like that, and it could cause some hiccups with the Gen 3. So if you know you're going to go out and go plant, you can leave that button pressed in. Just understand when you turn that key on and fire things up, try to turn right away. Don't let it go halfway through the boot cycle and then refire the machine. That's going to give us our best results there. Be solid green. And you shouldn't have to mess with that box too much, but understand the color of that does make a difference. I've got a chart here that shows all these different colors, and I don't think for overall we need you to know these things. The big thing is that if you were to have a hiccup or an issue, you know, your dealer might say, hey, what color is the light? That's going to help them determine where you're at with this and how we can get you out of that spot, okay? So if I back up here a second here, again, there's that recess button over here. And let's see here, where else was I going to go with that? Now, if there is, I remember what I was going to, if there is an issue and we're having a little bit of problems with things, it's hard to see on the screen here, but there is a little pinhole right next to the power side of things. We may, if there is a hiccup and we do get it locked in because of some kind of boot sequence, a small little hole there where you could take a paper clip and tap on there to do a hard reboot on things. Just understand that that's there. That shouldn't be something that you have to do, but I just like, as long as we're all talking about it today, understand where that's at on the DBM so we can do that if need be. Okay? So that's kind of a real quick breakdown of the DBM. So when you fire up your system, On the Gen 3s, guys, you're going to get a page that looks like this. Especially once you've gone to the 23 software, and this is going to be kind of motioning up and down and say master. We're pretty much saying that, hey, you've got stuff on this planner that's going to, when you flip that switch on, that's going to be in motion and can operate. You're taking responsibility for your planner. Now, we do have a spot over here that says cancel. If I were to hit cancel, we sometimes get phone calls from guys saying, hey, my planner doesn't work. And we're going to ask, does it say master up here? To get rid of that master, you simply got to take that first toggle switch, you flip him up and down, and that master goes away, and it's going to allow your system to function the way it's supposed to. Okay? Now, I did mention a little bit on the Gen 1 and Gen 2s about the diagnose and field view. I do want to take time, as long as I've got my PowerPoint up here. If I click on go into diagnose, so I'm missing one step on here. So I do have a diagnose button on my home page here. If I click on diagnose, it's going to bring up my diagnose page, and if I'm plugged into my field view module that you see here, FVM, and I click in here, there's a few settings I want everybody to understand here. So if I'm plugged in and it should have my field view username, and you have shared swath enabled or disabled. If you are only running one planter in a field at a time and you're not streaming between machines, you can switch this to disable. There's no need to send that or try to look for another machine using the same field view account. Also, when it comes to the Gen 3, the Gen 1 and Gen 2 are built off the same language as field view. When we went to the Gen 3, we knew there were other things that we wanted to do. This year we're getting into sprayers, we're doing strip till, we're doing seeders. And so the Gen 3 has got a little different language to it. And so we don't want field view to be making configuration changes. So if everybody could go ahead and click on config changes disabled, and we're just really, what we're doing is we're sending the information from the Gen 3 into field view, and field view is our listening device. Okay, and so because of that, we switch this to config changes disabled. Now, it takes that data and converts it so field view can read it. There is a card inside that field view module, and so depending on where your usage is on your card, if you're getting to be about 50% or higher, we want to make sure there's enough room going into planting season. And so we go ahead and we can, granted we've got everything into field view the way we want, we can delete the field view SD card. So if I click on it, it's going to pop up like so and say, hey, are you sure you want to delete all the data on the field view module SD card? Okay, and so we say yes, and it's going to go ahead and clear that out. Now, speaking of data, we need to make sure that there's room on both systems and that they're healthy before we go ahead and plant this year. And so I'm already at this second stage, so I'm going to back up one more time for everybody, and we're going to hit setup on the right hand side here. And again, this shows the version right over here. We click on the version, and it's going to give us, hey, what's our disk usage? So I'm only using 2% of 16 gig in this example. Now, on the Gen 3 side of things, I need to switch my system over to my live Gen 3. Okay, so now I've got my Gen 3 up here running. Okay, so on the Gen 3, I'm going to go to Setup, and I'm going to go to Systems. And underneath Systems, I need to scroll down on the right-hand side here till I get all the way down to Display. Okay, now that I'm on the display side of things, I can go to About. And About it, don't worry about your display disk usage. I want to know how much is in my DBM. All right, now it's thinking a little bit, it has to check in. Okay, now it pops up, I'm at 38%. Okay, again, if I've already got a year under my belt and I'm getting close to 50%, I'm probably going to want to get some data off of there so I've got room for next spring. This Gen 2's already been cleared out, so we're in good shape there. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter there. Now, if we're in class like this, I always like that this is a great time for us to think about sounds. So on the Gen 2 or Gen 1s, we're going to go ahead and hit Systems, and we're going to go down to Display, and then we're going to see across the top, we see Sound Settings. And under here, we can either click None, or you can go ahead and tap on the bar and drop those sound levels down. For those that are in class today, I'm going to try to remind you guys before we wrap up, but after we're done today, make sure you turn your sound levels back on. I don't want anybody to go to the field and it's not making any noise for you because the sound levels were turned off from class. Every once in a while I get somebody the next year that mentions that, okay? For Gen 3 users, we see right over here, our sound setting is right up here. And I just simply switched mine all to mute, so it's very easy to turn that back on. Now I will say with 23 software, we did bring in some fun sounds. So we'll just go through these here a little bit. All right, we got some fun ones there. We got, all right, it'll get her done. Now maybe we need to have this as our alert. Stop. Okay, telling us to stop in the field. Okay, and of course we even threw another little fun one in here. All right, the big thing is, guys, is make sure you choose something that gets your attention, right? Maybe something that doesn't annoy you too much. But get your sound settings set. We've got the alert, we've got our failure, and we've got our clicking in here. So again, for today, we're going to go ahead and just hit mute on these so it's not blaring as we're going through class. Make sure we turn those back on when we're done. Now, as long as we're in here, there's also brightness over here on the side. How bright is your screen going to be? We've got automatic and manual for both the display and the LED switch box. Over on our classic screen, we're going to go ahead and hit enter. And then we've got just down and to the left-hand side, we've got screen brightness. Again, we've got manual and automatic. I can tap on here and move that. Just so you guys are aware, the automatic on the classic screen, you see the little bump out, the little green LED on the side of your screen. That's the sensor on the Gen 1 and 2s. On the Gen 3, it's on the screen, but on the back side of the left-hand side there's two little bumps back there. One of those is your light sensor, and that's what's going to adjust that brightness in the cab if I've got that set to automatic. Okay, date and time, guys, don't get too concerned about that. We pull the date and time from your GPS. We're going to cover that here in a little bit. And so once your system in your tractor's fired up and we plug in, as long as you've got good GPS, the RMC signal is what's going to give us our date and time when we're running our 2020 in the cab. Okay? All right, so if we've got that done, we can hit enter here. We need to go to the data tab. So across the top here, we hit data on the classic screen. On the Gen 3, we're going to hit home. We're going to hit setup. And our tabs are along the side here. Data is the bottom one. And it starts on the export side. So before I delete anything, I need to export my field map data. So that's right over here on the side. We click on field map data. That's going to be all my raw data that from years past of planting. On the Gen 2, we go to export to USB. We see old field map data. We're starting a new year, so there shouldn't be any data in the current season. This would be if I need to offload anything if my 2020 got full. But if right now we're in the off season here, right before we get started here in about a month from right now, we click on old field map data. This screen's been emptied already. Now I mentioned earlier this one was a 16 gigabyte hard drive or memory space in there. So when we do put our memory stick in here to download, make sure you have one that's large enough. Okay, so 16 gigs going to handle any Gen 1 or Gen 2. You can have something slightly larger than it's fine. The Gen 3, however, is 32 gigs. So when we're thinking about a Gen 3, as long as I got a 32 gig thumb drive, that's what we want to use. Now, I will give you one bit of caution on the Gen 3s. I have had some folks, when they hit select all and they hit transferred, it might show that it's good, but you might get to the computer and find that some files are missing or doesn't look like it's there. My best luck when unloading data from a Gen 3 is to do it in about chunks of about 3. So if you break it into 3 chunks, download it in a thumb drive, we've had a little better chance of getting all that data off of your Gen 3 and then into the computer. Okay? Because I always like to keep an extra backup of my data. Once I hit delete, it's gone. All right, so both systems here, we back them up. So if we've got our data backed up onto our thumb drive, we're simply going to go ahead and now let's go to the delete tab. You'll see there's other options here. They're fairly self-explanatory. We're not going to go through every one of them today. But if we're going to delete some data off of here, we go to the delete side of things. What do we want to delete before planting? Well, we're going to go into that field map data. Okay, again, it's going to list everything that's already in this Gen 3. on the side here. You can select accordingly. Over on the classic side, we've got field map data, old field map data. Again, we're going to go into old. We split it apart on the classic screens. Okay, you'd select accordingly, hit delete, and you'll clear that up. Now I backed up a step. I'm going to do that on both of these here, because what else might we want to delete? So on the classic screen, and you have imported prescription and boundary files. Okay, if you've got prescriptions from the last year and you're going to use a different prescription this year, I like to keep things simple and kind of clean things up. So if I go into prescriptions up here, because if you happen to have a prescription for soybeans and you're going to plant corn this year and you accidentally select that soybeans prescription, guess what? It's going to spin that corn meter and try to hit 140,000 population that you had in your soybean prescription, right? So I do like cleaning out prescriptions ahead of time. Delete the old ones before we bring the new ones in, okay? So we go ahead and just choose ones. You'll notice here on the classic screen, you see the arrow down is highlighted. That means there's more options if I scroll down. As soon as I scroll down, notice that now the yellow arrow or the yellow box around the up arrow saying there's things up. That's kind of a common thread when running one of the classic screens. So let's see here. Notice there's one right here. If I want to delete that one, I simply hit delete. Are you sure? Yes. It's no longer in my pick list. Okay. So I'm going to leave these in my Gen 3 for now. Okay, so if we've deleted those out, you do notice there's a hybrid delete function in the Gen 3. We don't have that on the 2. You can actually modify your pick list real quickly here. So if you've got a bunch of different hybrids from years past that you want to clear out, you notice I've got quite a few hybrids showing up on here. I like to use my hybrid picks when I'm doing a lot of trials in that. So you can see here I've actually got a few products from Nature's, one of our partners in fertility. They've got some programs with us. And I've also did some stuff with AgriLiquid. I've got some treatments in here. So I actually use the hybrids to help record where those treatments are at. That way when I go to combine, everything's already pre-sorted based on hybrid, okay? But if I want to clean those up, I simply choose some of the ones that I'm not going to run this next year. So like here's one on our place I like to separate the headlands differently, so I just called them ends. And then put the same name there, select it, go ahead, delete selected, and it's going to pull that off of my list. I can still do this on the Gen 2, but I'm going to do that underneath when I select my hybrid. We'll show you that here in a little bit. Okay? So if we've deleted things off of there, as long as we're in the data tab, I'll back up a step here. And we can also import, right? This is where if we want to bring in prescriptions, or if we want to bring in boundaries, or if I want to bring in, other information, I can do that, okay? So if I'm going to bring in a prescription, it's going to ask, is it a seeding? Is it liquid? Is it granular? Is it depth? The Gen 3, I could have 4 different style shape files brought in, okay? Now on the Gen 2 and 1, if I go to import, I can just simply bring in a prescription or boundary. It's a shape file, and then I have to do something with it. So when would I actually use these differences? So I'm going to use an example, and I think the camera's going to grab the marker board right now. Yes? Okay. All right. So he's already got it set up. So I'm just going to, let's say that this field here is a field of soybeans. I'm going to make a real simple example of, say there's 4 shapes, right? And let's do some populations of 150,000, 150,000 here, maybe 130 here, 140 here, just for a real quick example. And so that would be a shape, right? We got 4 shapes, there's population in here. Now let's say I've got let's say I want to use soy green for some of my high pH zones, but they don't exactly match. Okay, on you guys that are running a Gen 2, if we're in charge of liquid, your soy green would have to be in these same shapes if I'm going to run a prescription for that. With the Gen 3, we're able to say, you know what, I want to apply soy green right in this area here, and I want to go 5 gallons an acre in just this red zone. I can actually make 2 shape files, one for seeding and 1 for the liquid application. Therefore, I have to choose when I bring it into the 2020, hey, which kind of prescription is this? And do so accordingly. So I say seating. Now, I don't have a thumb drive in there, so it's not going to go ahead and bring that in on that side of things, but it would then bring it into there, and I'll show you there in a little bit later on what that prescription is going to look like in that separate liquid prescription. Okay, so once those prescriptions are in, I think we've covered what we need to on the data tab side of things. There is also software update. If you guys did do the download that newer version of things, notice again here, software update here. You put that thumb drive in, you would click on here, install from USB. It does not see the USB right now. Okay, that's what you would do to do the software update. Okay, all right, with that being said, I think we'll go ahead and go back to the home page here. Now, this layout looks pretty complex. This is actually the layout I use on our own farm. Maybe if you want something a little more standardized or looks a little more simpler to what we do on the Gen 1 and Gen 2s. We'll kind of go into that side of things later for those of you that have the Gen 3s. But just mainly on the operation side of things now as we go in to start playing around and think about how do I set things up again. So first of all, we would go into the setup button on both systems, just one click, and so over here it's in the on the right hand side, here it's on the bottom again on the Gen 3, and you have this setup page. And so you've got on both screens, we've got what field are we in, right? We've got the planner setup, which we're not going to have to do too much messing around in the planner setup. Okay, that's going to be set. That tells the 2020 exactly what equipment we're working with on your farm. But on the field side of it, that's going to say, hey, what field are we going to be planting today? So if we go ahead and click on the field, our basic naming structure is like everybody else in the industry. We start off with the client, the farm, and then the field, okay? Client, farm, and field. The one in yellow here is the active one. If I'm going to make a change, I'm going to go ahead right now and on the Gen 2 click on Jason for the field. Notice it says over here make active, okay? Same thing over here. If I choose a different field, let me grab the driveway 11, I have to hit make active. If I hit home or back on either of these screens, I will not make that field active. It will back me up, but I'm in the same field I was in before. So make sure you remember, as you change fields, go ahead and click on the make active to switch it over to the next field, okay? So I'm going to do that on both of these here. Now here I've got a boundary file turned on or included, but I'm not letting it clutch off it. So I do get this pop-up saying, hey, we have an error load in the boundary file. No polygons in this boundary are controlled under the current swath control plan. Please update your control plan. So it's saying that you've got your swathing to not shut off based on a boundary. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Don't be concerned about that right now. Okay, I am going to go back into there one more time to share a few little quick snippets on it. So I'm going to go back to my demo field on the 2, and I'm also going to go back to driveway 57 on this one. Now, when I go in there, there is a boundary file already in place. I click on here. I find where that boundary file is at. It reads it in just fine. Over here, you click on the bottom is boundary file, and row flow demo boundary is the correct one. I arrow up and down until it's selected, and I hit enter. Okay, now if I'm going to run variable rate, if I'm row flow or I'm V-drive, okay, I have to have a prescription. So right here is where I would assign now. I've loaded those prescriptions in, and I go down to row flow demo pop. For those of you that are running a prescription on the Gen 2, it's going to ask what attribute are we running. This one has population. That all depends on who is writing your prescriptions for you, right? If I look on this one here, and I click on the Gen 3 and I say, hey, which one am I doing? East of Drive is the one that I had done. We do one of the Sibley County corn growers plots, and I always thought, you know, different hybrids react differently to different populations. So why should I just run one population across? So I actually had a very simple population map, and he said, where's the map? The first attribute pops up, says field. That's not the right attribute. I click on here. These are the 3 boxes to choose from. Target rate, the way that my guy wrote the prescription, okay, that brings it in. I can see now this is a very simple map. I had the north side of the field at 36,000, I had the south side at 33,000, so I could get a look at what those hybrids reacted like with those 2 different populations, right? Now you can also make some changes to your prescription if you want. You could select just one and make changes up or down. Here's my plus minus, or I could change it by percent, okay? Or I could select all of them and change them all the time. Now, depending on how sophisticated your shapefile is, depends on how well we can showcase this. If I get a pile of shapes in there, it's going to be really hard to distinguish which colors over here are on the map, and so you would want to do select all and either bump the whole works up or down or by a percentage, right? If you're going to make those adjustments on here. We'll show you a little bit later on the Gen 2. On the Gen 2, you can also do that, but we have to do that in a different spot. But on the Gen 3, we will bring this up as a preview as you go to head and want to make changes and bring things in. Say, hey, is this exactly what you want? I go ahead and hit save. It's going to say, okay, this example, I've got it set into different sections. And so it's going to say for each section. So I could technically, I could choose a different target rate if I had if my shapefile was built correctly for different sections. But I'm not going to do that. That's a little higher level class. Okay, so I'm just going to choose the same field for both of them. My prescription is ready to go in here. Okay, so I go ahead and hit make active. I'm going to go ahead again, make active here again too. Now, one other thing, I'm going to go back in there one more time and showcase one other piece in here, because what happens if we plant, let's say we plant really early, things kind of pop up, and all of a sudden we get a crazy frost that comes in and hits us, and we have to go back and replant. If I go back into here, you'll notice on the side now it says delete coverage on both of the screens. That's how I could wipe out what I've already planted, my coverage map, what's allowing my clutches and V-drives to turn on and off. I clear that area so it functions again. Okay? Those of you with the Gen 1 and Gen 2s, when you fired up, one of the pop-ups that may be set in, it says, hey, it looks like you have old coverage map from last year. Do you want to delete it all? Before we start is when we want to delete it all. Once we start planting, right, we don't want to mess around with it at that point unless we're going to go in and replant. We want those clutches to be able to start over again and how they function. Okay? All right, so I think we covered that pretty well on the field side of things. So I will spend just a little bit of time going into the planter side of things a little bit. I don't need you guys to go ahead and make any changes in here, but we can go into GPS setup. That is something I always like to kind of refresh our thoughts on a little bit. So we go ahead and click on there. On the Gen 3, we scroll down, and you'll see where we start seeing planter measurements, tractor measurements, GPS offset check. Okay? Now, on here, we probably want to start with GPS communications and talk through making sure that we're getting good signal. In fact, on the Gen 3, we're going to click over here in the top here, and that's going to bring us into GPS communications. We need to have, from your tractor GPS system, 3 strings of information: GGA, RMC, and VTG. GGA, RMC, and VTG. Now, they're listed in here, so you don't have to write those down, but what we do need to understand is the hertz and the baud rate, okay? Hertz is how often it's sending us information on where the GPS is at, where we're located, and the baud rate is the package size, okay? So 5 hertz is what we want for how often it's sending us that package of information. And then the baud rate is going to be 38,400 is where we've got the most consistent luck with. Some systems you'll have to send it as, they'll have the option as 38.4K, right? That's the same thing, just abbreviated. Okay, so this is the baud rate, and this is the hertz. So if you do an update to your GPS system, those are the numbers that we're going to probably have to turn back on again. A lot of times, like when the John Deere system gets an update, you'll have to reset in the John Deere monitor what to export for information. So these are the numbers that we need to punch in there, okay? And I mentioned earlier, the RMC version, that's where we get our date and time from. Okay, so this one's got a demo running. You can see I've got GGA RMC. My VTG should also be coming on there. All right, we should have good information. When we start the season, if you're using a prescription or a subscription, excuse me, for your GPS, so like RTK, SF2, something like that, make sure you have that turned on and functioning before we go ahead and do our GPS offset check here, which we're going to show you in a little bit. Okay, so if that's all happy, let's go ahead and we're going to hit back. And we're going to go to, I like to start with the planner measurements first, and you'll understand why here in a little bit. So on the Gen 2, I'm going to hit back up. So we got good GPS communication. So now we go into the planner side of things, right? How does that planner function? Okay, do we have all the rows straight across in the back in a single row like this? Are they offset? Are we running 15-inch corn, or excuse me, 15-inch beans and 30-inch corn? So this dual front would be very common for a Kenzie push-pull system. If you're like that, but say a John Deere 1790, you would have your inner rows accordingly. Center trailing, so like our 1770 NTs, where you got your rear wheels are trailing behind. Okay, these are your different functions you can have. We're going to just choose single in this example, both here. Then you've got your hitch style. Okay, do I just simply put the pin in the drawbar, or do I attach to the 3-point but it pivots behind there, or is it a mounted planner? Okay, the reason I bring up the 2-point pivot, and I've got it pictured up on this one here, the same layout pretty much, is when we take our measurements, it's from the pivot point that we go from there to the transport tires for A, and then a C drop for B. And then when I go to the tractor measurements, I have to go from that same pivot point forward on the tractor. All right? So if I go ahead on the Gen 2 here, I'm going to choose that drawn. And again, the hitch style, same type of thing. Hitch pin, 2-point pivot, or that 3-point. If I do the 3-point, right now it's showing from the rear axle of the tractor, because as that tractor turns, that's what's going to determine how that planner pivots and follows accordingly. I'm going to go ahead and switch him back to a drawn. So if that makes sense for us on there, let's go ahead and then jump. Oh, for those of you that maybe have a little more sophisticated style, if I click on here and I scroll down, you'll notice here we even have dual rear center trailing. You say, what planner are you using? Actually, our Momentum planner from AGCO has the center trailing, and so if they do 15-inch beans and 30-inch corn, they'll actually have 4 different seed exit points. Okay, so if you need to, that's where we have all these different layouts. So for today, again, I'm going to just use the single. Now, if we go through here, let's go ahead then and jump to the tractor measurements. So I'm going to hit back on the Gen 2 and hit the tractor there. So on the tractor side of things, it looks pretty, we give you a pretty good diagram on things, but like I mentioned on the planner, this A measurement is from the rear axle to where the planner pivots from. And so the picture is going to show the drawbar where you put the hitch pin. But like I mentioned just before, if we've got that, I'm just going to make this change on the Gen 2 here so you can see about the same time, right? If I am the 2-point pivot, this pivot point is actually where I need to measure from the rear axle to that pivot point. Okay, so that A measurement can be off a little bit if we're not paying attention to those details. Okay, the B measurement is your side to side on your globe. The big thing there, folks, is we want to make sure that your tractor and planner, make sure your GPS is happy, so drive back and forth on an AB line, turn around, come back the other way. If your planner's not trailing correctly, fix the tractor steering first. Right? Get that centered so that it's following the same tracks. Once that's done, then do I have side-to-side play showing up on my map? Then you would go ahead and make a change to your B measurement. Okay? Make sure you fix the tractor steering first before you change the adjustments in the 2020 system. Okay? Your C measurement goes from your rear axle to where the globe is at. That sounds pretty self-explanatory, and for a lot of you folks, that's going to be exactly what it is. The ones we see a little hiccup with is if you're using a nav box from Trimble, so either a Trimble steering system or even the Case or New Holland monitors that use Trimble in their steering, that where we export the GPS from in those systems may export the data as the rear axle, not where the globe is at. And so you might have to put a 0 value in for C in that case. And don't worry, we're going to show you how we're going to catch that here in a little bit when we do our offset check, but that might be a value you have to worry about. Okay? Now if we switch to some different style of tractors, if I go to a 2-track system on the Gen 2, you notice my picture doesn't change. If I switch over here and I go to a track system, this looks like we're expecting a 2-track system to look like. Now, this picture for the top view that shows us our A measurement and C measurement, we do have to move that adjustment. So if I turn my steering wheel on a front wheel steer system, it's going to pivot off the rear axle like it shows. When I go to a 2-track system and I turn the steering wheel, it's going to pivot about right here. That tends to be about the front of your seat in the cab. So if you're running a 2-track system, we need to move this AC rear axle measurement to about the front of your seat, because as you turn the steering wheel, that's how that tractor is going to pivot. Okay? So you just got to be a little creative as we take a look at that measurement there. Now the last one is a little bit more crazy, is our articulate. So if you're running a 4-wheel drive that articulates, and that's how we're running that's the tractor we're running on in front of the planter, we have a few more measurements to put in here. Okay? Now on the Gen 3, we can do the GPS offset check. On the Gen 2, we will not be able to do that. So we have to spend a little bit more time validating our clutching timing is on and off correctly when we get to that part, if we're running a Gen 2 with a 4-wheel drive pulling the planter. Okay? It's still going to do it, but there's a lot more measurements and stuff that takes place. And I go back to, again, we had someone last year that was running a Trimble system in a Case tractor, and we actually, the E measurement, which again is that globe to front axle, we had to put a 0 value in there to get things right for our setbacks and our timings and that. So just a few little things to consider there. Okay? Back to a front wheel steer and hit enter. And I'm going to go ahead and change this one as well. Once we've made all our changes here, and we want to say, okay, let's go ahead and make sure this is right. So this is where we hit the GPS offset check. We can do, as long as we got good signal and open area, we can go ahead and do this ahead of time. And so it's nice to have a second person when you do this. Grab a few flags, set your AB line with the tractor, pull so the tractor's pulling true, the planter's pulling true, put the planter down in plant mode. When you come to a stop, you're going to hit enter, and that's going to lock in the GPS in latitude and longitude of that, where that globe is at. Okay? Before you take off, you put a flag on both sides of the gauge wheels where that seat exit's going to be on. If you've got multiple seed drops, it's going to be your front seed drops. Okay? And you do that on both systems. You hit enter. Like I said, it locks that in. Then you simply raise that planter back up and you make a sweeping motion, turn around the opposite direction, let the system lock in on that AB line again and start pulling through. Once you start getting close to where the flags are, hit continue. All we're doing is giving you a page with some instructions on how to do this. Now as you pull back through again, start slowing down, get the planter into plant mode, have somebody standing on the outside of the planting of the flags here, and as you get close with that planter, come to a complete stop. You want to be centered between both of these. So if that planter isn't pulling true and it's pulling sideways a little bit, split the difference between the planter, or between the flags with the planter. Now that's where it's important to have that person on the other side. You can back up. Don't back up with the planter in the ground. That's going to cause issues, right? But make sure you get yourself centered, and then once you're lined up, you hit enter, and it's going to take another latitude and longitude of where the globe is at. And it's going to say, okay, this is what you told us for measurements. This is what we saw. Here's the difference. Now this one's getting cut off a little bit here. They should be pretty tight. Okay? If you're running RTK signal, I would like to see you less than 6 inches. If not, we want to remeasure those measurements again and double check them because there's probably something off. Okay? This is where if you're running one of those nav boxes and we've got that globe to rear axle number in there, this is where we typically catch that. Okay? And we can correct that before we ever get to the field. Your side-to-side measurement on your B, okay, did he stay true or is it off to the side? Again, you would go ahead and make those adjustments as necessary. If you make major changes to that, I really strongly recommend running the GPS health check again and get things in good shape, okay? Once we've done that and got that locked in, on the Gen 3 here, you'll notice there is a Save Load button. I would like you to go ahead and save those configurations. Now, today we're running, when I run class, I've got a 16-row planner, test planner. We would simply hit Update because the one in the green here shows this is the active planner. I've made the changes. I hit Update. Are you sure you want to update this configuration? Yes. Okay, we were successful. Okay, if there's nothing in here, you need to save your current configuration. You're going to go ahead and save the current configuration. It's going to give you one completely there. You need to do the same thing for the tractor. Okay, we're running an MX200 on our farm. I could simply hit Update on there as well. Now, I don't want to do that because I would mess up my measurements that I have in here. Okay. Once these are saved, if I switch back and forth into YieldSense, if you're using that product, over here you can click and switch to Combine. We're not going to do that today for time's sake, but that's where you can make that change. On the Gen 2 and Gen 1s, we do hold those settings in there as we switch back and forth accordingly. Okay? All right, we spent a little bit of time on that planner setup page. We're going to get past that. So again, we're back into this main page. We've covered field, we've covered planner on both of the systems. Now let's get down to the actual corn hybrids. What are we going to plant? So you click on the corn hybrids page. Maybe you finished off with soybeans last year and it says soybeans. How do we switch crops? Okay, a couple different ways we can do that. Notice over here it says active crop. We can change and edit the crop by clicking on the side here. We've got listed all the different crops that we have to choose from. I'm going to go ahead and continue to click on corn. Corn is active. On this side here, if I want to change crops, I actually have to back up a step and go to the Crops tab on the side, and then what's my active crop? Click up here. Corn is currently chosen. I also have soybeans and sugar beets as an option here. Okay? We'll talk through this here in a little bit later. So I've got corn chosen, so I'll go back to my setup and I click on my hybrid. You can have 4 different hybrids being recorded across the planner at any point in time. Right now you can tell in both cases here I've got 2 different hybrids chosen. This Pioneer number's over here, this one's over there. If I want to change these, I go simply click on any of these different colors. And I've got a pick list, like I mentioned, with a lot of different things already in it. Okay, I also do I do a nitrogen trial, so I've got a urea and then the hybrid name, because we do make a pass next to the driveway each year to show that versus when we split our nitrogen. Okay, so I like to use hybrids for that kind of way. So if I want to add one from a database, I simply click on here, and you can start punching away. So I'm going to put in like 4188 cropland number. Now anything that's 4188 is going to pop up on here. Notice there's a couple different ones in here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and choose this one here. Hey, which rows? I'm going to say all for now. And it's going to assign it all the way across here. Notice it says cropland genetics. Pops it in there. I hit done. Now that one's all the way across. Okay, I can choose a different color. If there's one that maybe doesn't show up on here, let's try, I'm just going to start punching some numbers in here once. And if I don't see the number that's on that I'm looking for and say, hey, it's not showing up, I'm going to have to back out. So I'm going to hit cancel, and then I'm going to go add custom hybrid. And I can go ahead and punch in, let's see here. Let's just go ahead. We're going to call one, let's see here. Today, when we're recording this, it happens to be Thursday, so I'm just going to put in here Thursday. Let's put just Thur in there, okay? We hit enter, it's going to say, okay, it's a custom name. We're going to put that on, let's say, the right half of the planter. How many seeds per unit? I hit done, okay? So that is now a custom name in my list. On the Gen 2 and Gen 1s, very similar process. Now the software, last known software on the Gen 1 was in 17, so the pick list in the 17 has not been updated, so more likely your hybrids that you're planting are not in there. If you are using FieldView, you can add the hybrid name through FieldView. It will pull it across into here, but understand though that when you go into there, your seeds per unit will always default to 80,000, which is fine for corn, but what happens when we go into a crop like soybeans? So I'm going to go ahead and switch this to soybeans, and when I back up and I go ahead and my soybean numbers, if I add variety, if I bring in one that is not over here, let's see if they're showing up. See, it shows up as add as custom, okay? Now this one happened to still hold it at 140,000. Okay, just be watching that. If I bring it in through FieldView and I put in a custom hybrid, this will say either nothing or 80,000. You need to make sure and tap and switch this, otherwise the Gen 1 and 2s will not track the units correctly, right? I'm hoping you're getting a few more seeds than 80,000 in a bag of soybeans, right? So make sure we're watching that when we're talking on the classic screens accordingly, okay? So for my example here, I'm going to switch this back to corn. And you could even go to a listing point here where you could go every other row if you wanted to. I'm not sure why anybody would plant that way, but you can see we can do that, okay? Now you will get a little pop-up if I've got, let's go ahead and I'm going to grab the yellow color here and just grab a different one. Let's go ahead and grab, you can see I got a lot of different stuff in here to choose from. All right, yeah, we just grab this DeKalb number, we hit enter, I'm going to hit all. So there are two different things chosen, so when you hit home or back, you will get a pop-up that just says, hey, you've got other colors with names in them that are not assigned to this planter. Do you want to proceed? Yes, you can proceed. It's still going to plant. It's not going to not plant. It's just saying that, hey, you've got some things in there, okay? All right. So now that we've got our hybrids selected, we've got everything else. Now you notice I don't have over here, you do have your population set points. We don't see them over on the Gen 3. In the Gen 3, we've put them in a different spot under seeding. Over here, we do want to set our population up ahead of time. You have 8 points that you can set on there. If you're a ground drive system and you're just setting it, and you have one transmission setting, you can go ahead to hit single setting and you just mess with one number. If you're row flow or V drive, you're probably going to want to use these other boxes. Now we have 8 set points for the entire planter no matter what crop you're planting. On the Gen 3, we're specific on the crop, and so we can have set points for each crop that we have in here. So in this example, you see that we've got some corn numbers on top, we've got some soybean ones on the bottom. I don't like leaving a 0 ever in a set point. We actually have the software smart enough that it won't let you choose 0, but I just never like to have that even as an option, because guess what? If the 2020 says, hey, you tell me a 0 population, you're trying to plant, we get a phone call that says, hey, why can't I plant? It's not airing at me, because you told it 0, right? So I always like to have something in there. I do like to have these boxes populated on only the crop that I'm active in, because here again, let's say I'm planting corn and all of a sudden I accidentally tap 140, it's going to try to hit 140. So I do like to only keep them in there. It's totally up to you how you run your system. Same thing, if I'm in planting soybeans and I accidentally click on 32,000, it's going to crank down and only plant 32,000 when I'm planting beans, okay? So go ahead and we get our settings sitting there. They don't have to be in any particular order. You can have some of the same numbers. It's not a big deal, but go ahead and have that filled out. All right, with that all in order, let's go ahead and I've got the Gen 2 running in a demo, so I'm going to actually switch to my PowerPoint here just shortly here, so I can show you some things. as we talk through the different metrics on the screen itself. So let's go ahead and I got to switch this back to the PowerPoint. Okay. All right, so as we walk through and take a look at some of the basic operations as we're planting, one of the first things is going to be is our population on the screen, right? The large number here is our average seeds that we're planting per acre. And underneath that, we see the low and the high row being showcased across the planter. So real quickly from a glance, I can tell where we're at. And I can click on there. And of course, the demo just happened to be turning around at the time. When we're actually operational, we can have it as one of our maps on the Gen 3, so we can see every row, the population. Across the bar chart on the bottom, we've got a population. Now here it actually shows we've got two different pops that we're hitting as we go across. Okay. All right, notice that over here in the Gen 2 that was running. Again, I click on there, I can see a quick bar chart that shows everything at layer 2. If I want to see exactly a specific row, I can click in there. Same thing on the Gen 3, I can click on it. I can see that bar chart. It's going to show me every row. This happens to be a 48-row planter at the time, right? I see 48 bars going across there, up or down where we're at. Here we're seeing the row details. Again, we happen to be at a spot where we clutched off, so let me go back into that row design. On the Gen 3, similar function. I recorded this ahead of time. You can see those row 3, and this example, row 5 details that's taking place going across there. Now, we're only looking at that row at this point, right? So we go ahead and we're going to just back up from there. So what would cause me to have my population box? As we talk through these different metrics, what would cause these numbers to be erratic or not reading what seems to be correct? And one thing you see on here is we've got some dusty conditions. Okay, so if we have a real strong back wind to us as we're planting, and I've got a standard seed tube with a light beam going across there, if that light beam gets broken a bunch, it's going to read erratically, right? So if I get dusty conditions like this, you might see that population take off and start climbing, look really crazy across there. It might be the conditions that you have. Another example would be soybeans. Soybeans are running a high population rate. You might get a bunch of soybeans that come by that beam of light and only break it once, and so we might underpopulate. Here's an example where we've got a 16-row planter. He's planting 140,000, but notice on the screen we see in a lot of orange that's more in that 130,000 range, but he's got 4 wave visions on that planter, which we don't care about dust or about, you know, if that light beam gets broken once. So soybeans, we can actually read beans really accurately, and we can see that the system is functioning correctly. We're right at that 140 where we wanted to be at, but the rest of the sensors are reading about 10,000 off because of that high population rate. Okay, so those would be some things to think about on the population side. Here's another example. Again, here you can see we see some difference in population going one direction versus the other direction. Again, that could be that getting some dust that was blowing up on the sensors and how it was reading differently. Okay. So that's the population. We move on to the next box, singulation. There we're talking about skips and doubles. And some of this might depend also upon what style of meter that you have. So again, we showcase the average singulation. Guys, we want to be at 99%. 99 and higher is where we want to be at. For every percent we lose on that is about 2 to 5 bushels of yield loss. And so when you think about it, you say, well, that doesn't necessarily sound like a lot. Well, it depends on what we're working with, right? But we're always showing the high and the low row, so I can really quickly isolate that. Now you notice over here I've got skips and multiples to the side. Over here it's another spot of the breakdown of what's going on, because depends on the meter that you have is how I'm going to handle that, what am I going to do with that information. Now I've got a screenshot of what that looks like on field view, but we'd also on the Gen 3 could show a similar map on singulation that every 1/5 of a second we're flagging if there's a skip or there's a multiple. And so I bring this map up here. This happens to be a positive air meter system, and if you're familiar with positive air meters, they like round seed. If you don't get round seed, they can really struggle with it. And so in this example here, he starts out, he's planting rounds, and he's got things set just right. He's at 99%. But you know, his seed guy was only able to get him flats in the next number he goes to plant. And so he puts the flats in, and notice that there's a whole pile of blue showing up on here. His singulation was showing across the whole planter 92%. So he goes ahead and he looks, and it's all sorts of multiples. That's why we're seeing the blue on here. And so what's he do? He drops the pressure down. By dropping the pressure down, now all of a sudden he's got a bunch of red showing up. He's got a bunch of skips. So he doesn't like that, so he cranks his pressure up. Now he's got more blue, drops it down, now he's got more red. He cannot get singulation over 92%. Okay? So if he's 99 here, and he's 92% here, that's 7%. Let's take 2 bushels per percentage sign. This hybrid's in a 14 bushel deficit just because of the way it's planting under singulation. Now, when we built this map for the grower, I said, hey, what happened over here? Because now we've got, we got 99, 92, and now we got 96. He says, well, I couldn't take this 92 anymore, so I blended the rest of my rounds with my flats, and I brought my average up to 96%. Okay? But it depends on what you guys have for a meter system. If you've got something like a John Deere Pro 40 or a Case AMS meter where you have individual adjustments, you might have to go to that singulation page and make those adjustments, those dialing on a row by row situation. If I go into the singulation page, and let's say in this 16-row planter, I've got 8 rows that have a bunch of skips and 8 rows that are doing well, what's the difference? I'm going to probably ask you a question that like, hey, how many vacuum blowers do you have? And you say, well, I got 2. Okay. Do we have the vacuum on rows 1 through 8 is too low, and therefore we're seeing a bunch of skips, and we have to increase the vacuum so that they match up? Okay. What's taking place out there? Let's look at this map here. All of a sudden I see singulation, and it's only in 1 row. Okay. So if I'm on the home page, all of a sudden, hey, row 10 has got low singulation. What are we going to do if that's you and you're planting like that? Your mission. All right. So if we see this again, right, where we all of a sudden have 1 row that's got some singulation errors and it's showing up on the screen, we want to take that meter apart, right? There's probably something going on in a row-based scenario. In this scenario, we open it up, and sure enough, there's a cracked seed that was jammed in there. So every time that meter made a swing through there, we were seeing that same exact pattern taking place, and we knew that there was a skip. Okay, so let that screen help you investigate what's going on in the system. Let's identify the issue, let's fix it, and be good to go. Now maybe it might be something like, hey, it seems like I got goofy singulation on just a couple rows. We might have to think bigger picture. Is there something blocking that vacuum tube? Okay. You just don't know what's taking place. I show this example here. We had one where the guy was really having a tough time where the entire planter was dropping a whole bunch of skips and gaps at times. And we found out that the vacuum tube itself was cracked, and every time he went over a bump, that tube would open up, it would drop the vacuum out, all the meters would lose their seed until the tube was solid again, right, and then had enough vacuum to pull the seed through again. It was nothing to do with the technology. It was telling them there was an issue, but we have to use this to decipher what's going on with my equipment, how can I fix it, and make sure we're running the way we want to. Okay? So that's the singulation side of it. Mainly, we're talking about, again, the meters. So that takes us down into the spacing side of things. And so when we take a look at here, we always kind of pose the question of, here's a skip, here's a double, here's a skip, here's a double. And if I'm planting this direction, is it truly a singulation error, or is it a spacing error? Okay, and obviously I'm actually setting you up for this, right? It is a spacing error. Something happened, this guy was late to the game, this guy was late to the game. And so the 2020, all 3 of these 2020s, Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, are going to determine that. And so we've got 2 metrics here. We've got seed release index, SRI, or we've got good spacing. In fact, on this Gen 2 here, you see that I have an SRI button right here, and I've got good spacing. So if I click on SRI, I do get a bar chart as well. We haven't talked to it as much on the classic side of things. So I always hate having wordy slides, but guys, this is the wordiest slide I've got here, is both SRI and good spacing, when we look over here, are both showing and grading us on where our spacing is on our planter. They are both isolating issues. We understand that when we're asking for our target population and based on our row width, we expect a seed every so often. And so when the system notices there's a gap followed by one that's really tight, we say, oh, that's not singulation. That's a spacing SRI metric. So we segregate those two pieces out. We show the low and the high row, okay? And a lot of times it's pointing us to our drivetrain issues or something to do, you know, that's affecting spacing, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. What's different with SRI is that seed release index is how consistent is our spacing, okay? The tricky part in our good spacing metric on the Gen 1 and 2s is you and I have to set that in the system. In fact, there's a big chart here that showcases that. And we show over here is where the metrics come down for misplaced seed limits. So when we go into our Gen 1 or 2 systems, we go to setup here and we go to crops. You're going to see we've got limit adjustments, and I'll show you this on the Gen 3 here shortly. But underneath this limit adjustments, what you're not going to see in the Gen 3 is there's a misplaced seed limits and a spacing limit. These two we have to put in there. So if you look down at a 30-inch row at 38,000, okay, that's 5.5-inch spacing. Okay, here's our economics, 2.5 and 4 inches. That's what we see here. If some of you guys are running a planter that's narrower rows or a lower population, so let's jump over to, say, a 22-inch planter, because I know I've got sugar beet guys in my area at times, maybe not so much in this crowd, or a 20-inch row, say, corn planter, and I go to, say, let's go to the 22s, 38,000. Now I've got 7.5-inch spacing, okay? My planter's going to have to be off a lot more before I hit these spacing issues. Therefore, this spacing might not be the best way to see how consistent is my seed drop, versus SRI is very consistent on that, okay? So if I look on my Gen 1, Gen 2s, you also have an economic adjustment. We don't have that in the Gen 3. It's primarily just in the Gen 2 system. Here's where we say, hey, my ears per bushel, cost per bushel, for every skip, every multiple, and here's my misplaced seeds. And here's my economics. So if you want if you're worried about how your loss per acre works, here's your, has to get past $6, or this first box before we tell you a dollar value, the second box before we turn it yellow, and the third box before it turns red, okay? We're not gonna have that on the Gen 3 side of things. But let's go ahead and just quickly jump over to the Gen 3. And over here we go to setup, and we go to crops, and right here again. So let's talk through this crops page as long as we got them on both of them. Okay, what's the active crop? We talked about that. What's our seeds per disc? If we're controlling with V-drive or row flow, that seeds per disc is a big deal. If we're just watching it, it's not a big deal because we're not on control. And then we go to default population. Okay, default population, how many seeds? If we have a prescription and we lose GPS, what do you want us to convert to? And so each crop has this, and then when you go into the crop, you'll see on the side it says, out of RX you have default, which would be whatever you enter in here, or you can tap on it and switch to current. Over on the Gen 3, we show it on the side here, current or default. Okay, so why would I want to change that a little bit? Why does that make a difference? Let's go back to the marker board a little bit and pretend that this marker board is a field. I had a customer down by the New Ulm area that has some river bottom ground, and right along it's both really good and really tough soil at the same time. Right close to the river, it's sand, and in that sand, we would drop his population down to 22,000 population, okay? But yet, right next to that, his soil line would change so different. He has some really rich, heavy soil up here. We would push that same hybrid up to, say, 36,000 population. So in this case here, let's say that we're planting. So in this example, we're going to use the red marker as the planter, right? If we're planting in the 36,000 zone, and now I get into the 22,000 zone, well, guess what I said? This is river bottom ground. How good is my signal down there? Not real great because of our elevation. All of a sudden, I lose GPS. If I set it to default, it's going to jump this to 32,000. If I set it to current and I'm in the 22,000 zone and I lose GPS, I will continue to plant at the last known population. So I will stay planting. I will go to radar and I will plant this at 22,000. Now, if I still don't have any signal and I come back out of there into the 36, I'm going to still be at 22, right? So just understand, but that's why we have that. Now, if I'm in manual, it'll do whatever I tell it manually. The other case would be, let's say that my prescription got written just a little bit short. Let's say my prescription cuts off like this. And I end up planting with part of that planter outside of that prescription zone. What do I want it to do? Current, so the last one it knows, or the default? That's the other time where that out of prescription zone is going to come into play. Okay? All right. What's that? So I typically have guys do current, so whatever you're in, but just understand if it loses GPS, you're kind of on your own at that point. So you got to just watch when you get to that soil line then. And he understood that because you guys know your fields like that to know what to switch to. So I prefer doing the current. That way it does whatever last was known. But again, all user preference to you guys on how you want to set up your system. Okay. Some other things in here is what rows are active. Now, if you run all your rows in corn, all your rows in beans, that's fine. This is where you could really differentiate. If I'm a 15-inch row planter for beans and I'm a 30-inch row planter for corn and I'm not using those other rows, this is where by crop you can say, hey, which rows on the planter are we using for this crop in the configuration side of things. Okay? Quick adjust population, so like when I'm going to be planting, so in this example here I'm showing the row flow side of things, and I'm going to make a change to if I take my population control and I switch to manual and I want to bump up or down my population, so right now I'm at 29,000, how big a step am I going to take? That's where my quick adjust population number comes from. So corn, 500 seems to be a good number to have. Beans, that might be too small to make jumps on, so I might want to change my soybean number to maybe 1,000, okay? Again, total user preference on that. Seeds to average, how far are we looking back? When we look at all this information from population, singulation, space, how far back on the planter are we looking at? Okay, corn we tend to say 300 because you guys are probably planting 30-some thousand. Okay, soybeans, average probably 140,000. I think our seeds to average numbers typically on beans is 1,500. All right. Like if I get guys in sugar beet country, they like to plant their sugar beets somewhere in the high 50s, low 60s, some thousand, so they'd probably put 600 in there for seeds to average. How far back are we looking to get these numbers? Okay, we have to have a certain amount of data we're going to look at so that we can report that information on that page. Okay, and then on the side here is where we start having our limits. When do we want the page, let me go back to here. Back to the home page. When do I want these colors to change and alert me to things? So if I start off with seeding, okay, 1,000 seeds. So if my target is 29,000, how far does he got to get off? Well, if he drops below, 28, it's going to get flagged. If it gets over 30, it's going to get flagged depending on what my set point is, right? I can change that up or down. Let me go back into the crop here. So that is limit adjustments right here. Okay, so in this one I've got it set at 1,000. Okay, what's your population alarm? You know, if you run out of seed on row 5, it's not going to take long before you're going to drop below 80% of target, right? And tell you, hey, you got a row failure here. So that's where that one shows up at. Singulation. I believe our default is like 98.5. If you've got a good meter that's hunting, you maybe want to go to 990, or even you crank it up to like 995. That's all dependent on what you want it to do, okay? If it gets below that is when it's going to turn yellow on you and say, hey, your singulation is below where you set it at, okay? Good ride alert, ground contact, SRI limit. Again, these are all user defined where you want to have them at. And like we mentioned, the Gen 1 and 2s, you do have that spacing metric here. We're more focused on SRI, like I mentioned before, because it doesn't matter if you're a 30-inch row planter, if you're a 20-inch row planter, it doesn't matter if you're planting 36,000 population or 29,000 population, you're getting a consistent, how consistent is my seed drop? And on the SRI number, we want that number to be lower, not higher. It's a little different. All other numbers, we try to get to 100%. On SRI, we're trying to get on the lower side of things, okay? Now, if you're running some of our other products, here's where we could do, like, say, nitrogen. I've got a liquid product on here. Let me go to my starter on here. So, and I'll come back to this probably when we do some more talk on the liquid side at the end of the day. But if we're in control and we've got individual control, I can keep this pretty tight. If I've got a starter pump that somebody else is in control of and it's going through a regular diaphragm and it might bounce a little bit more, you might need to widen that alert range out a little bit wider. And even like if it takes a little bit for that pump to spool up, you might need to back off how much time before the alert takes place. So you could actually change this to maybe, you know, up to 10 seconds if need be, so that when you're starting and stopping at the headlands, that it's not falsely beeping at you all the time. And then of course we can set the what do we want to have take action, okay? Jump to the bar chart, to the home page, row details, or take no action, okay? Again, all user preference, make sure you put your default rate in there. We move down, smart firmware's one that probably need to take a look at. I think I've got that one turned on here. Nope, I don't. Okay, so if I told this one to be smart firmware, which there is no data for in my example, now you see the smart firmware alerts pop up on here. Okay, now everybody might chuckle at the first one, but right? What point are we going to turn that box yellow if it's 55 degrees? What point are we going to turn it red? Okay, now we're up here in Minnesota. Are there times that we plant when the conditions are cooler than that? Yeah, there is. And if you don't like having something not green on your home page, you might have to adjust those numbers. That doesn't change the fact that we're planting cool conditions, right? But that sensor on that smart firmer is giving us some of that information of how warm that ground is as we're going through it. Okay? It's also giving us information such as how clean is the furrow. Now, depending on how well you handled your trash last fall or what your tillage is, you may or may not be able to get some of that information in a better shot using your row cleaners. That might have been something we had to do a better job or a different type of tillage in order to handle some of that. So again, these are going to be when your colors change on a home page here. Moisture, we want to see 30% moisture to be able to get that seed to germinate, right? To imbibe water and take off. And so when would I be okay with having less than 30% when I'm planting? So if you have a rainstorm that's predicted and then you know it's coming and I'm at, say, 28% or 28% moisture, do I necessarily want to go deeper to get into moisture if I know that it's 100% chance of rain coming, like I can see the front coming? I don't need to go deeper, right? Because I know there's going to be rain coming. I'm going to have moisture. Now, if there's no moisture in the forecast and I'm under 30% moisture, I'm going to take that handle, I'm going to go deeper so I'm into moisture, right? But this is where you can set your limits on the smart firmer side of things. Okay, so that's underneath here. So let's go ahead and I'm going to switch this back again. Okay, so again, if we go back on the spacing, seed release index, how consistent we are. 15 and lower is a good number. We really want to stay under 20. Okay, you can get to single digits at times if you're really paying attention to things. So let's talk about, what actually causes issues with spacing. And that's going to be our seed tubes, our drive system, and our ride quality. Those are kind of the big three silos. Now there's multiple things in each one of these categories that's going to affect spacing, but these are kind of the main areas. Now, seed tube wear, when we talk about seed tubes, that's one of the areas. Now, the tough thing here is these aren't going to show up on the spacing metric because the sensor's up here. Okay, so this is just a little more of a commercial. Let's make sure we're doing a good job of our maintenance side of things. And also that we are trying to protect these so that our seed tube guard does not only help protect the seed tube, but can also play a role in getting to depth. You take a look at, this one's the brand new one, this is the war one. It's going to be tough to get that seed at the bottom of the trench here, which is going to mess up some other things down the line. But as long as we're bringing that up, I figured we needed to mention that. Now, as far as seed tube, we want that seed to fall down nice and evenly and not touch the side. We know that when it touches the side of the seed tube, it starts bouncing around in here. It takes him longer to fall down. Part of that is by setting the bar. So if I look at my spacing or SRI and I say, man, it looks like it's really off, I click in there. Is it the whole planter? Is it a section of the planter? Is it a row of the planter? If it's the whole planter, one of the things is my bar height in good shape? If it's nose diving like this, I'm probably playing plinko with my seed. I simply level off the planter bar when it's in motion, right? It might be nice and level when we're sitting in the yard or even at the end of the headlands, but when we put that tractor and drive and take off, does it start leaning forward? If it does, I need to get that bar in a healthy position so that the seed doesn't touch, and you'd be surprised how fast your good spacing or your SRI clean up just because of something simple like that. Now, what if I looked in here and I have one row? Let's say row 5 all of a sudden has really bad spacing, but the rest of them are looking great. We want to take that meter off and inspect what's going on that row. Look down that seed tube and hey, there's a seed tag that got caught in there. Okay? Over the years, there was a guy in class that chuckled and he says, yeah, I found my screwdriver that I've been missing since I worked on the planter. Because did it mess up the meter? No, the meter was I'm still getting my same population, right? It was messing the spacing up because of how it was bouncing down and getting delivered to the bottom of the seed tube. Now, others I said is the drive system. What's spinning those meters? If we've got a transmission in place, is it the left half of the planter? Is it the right half of the planter? Do I have 2 transmissions? Okay. Is it just certain rows? If I got a 1770 NT, is it just rows like 7 and 8, 9 and 10? And we'll talk about the hex shaft in a little bit. But you have all these areas such as your clutches, your bearings, your sprocket, your idlers, your chains, right? They all play a part in it. We think of just how often is that chain making its way around and through all those sprockets and its way back again. Now it's made a few revolutions as we've been talking here. Now you take that and multiply it times the entire season, right? These are some bad examples, some pretty nasty examples, but how bad are those chains? What are we depending upon them? We got to make sure they're in good shape. They can get to the point where they actually cause us to have singulation issues. Here was one sprocket and chain that started jumping, and it actually dropped our population down 2,000 seeds per acre. One sprocket, one chain, and we fix things back up again. Now I mentioned the drive and driven, so most of us have a planter that folds out at some point. So if these shafts don't match up, now they're not off a lot, right? It's still gonna spin. I'm still gonna get the population I'm shooting for, my meters are still going to singulate, but my spacing and SRI are going to be off on those driven side of things. So again, if I go in here, I'm going to just pick on, say, a 16-row planter. If I notice that my rows 7 and 8 are looking bad, these 2 rows are probably driven off of here. I got to get these 2 shafts lined back up straight, because it's going to be tight further apart. Okay? Use this information to figure out what's going on in the planter to get things figured out. Now, if the whole planter is bad on spacing, one of the things we mentioned was good ride. Okay, and I have on here for most, okay? Our modules have accelerometers in them all up until, you know, when COVID hit and we started having a tough time getting our hands on product, we couldn't get accelerometers, and we had a choice to make. We had to say, okay, we're going to make some product without accelerometers, or we're just going to not make that product for a while. And so we did make some SRMs without, and the light that blinks on them is going to be yellow instead of red, and it's going to be laser scribed on it by the serial number. It's going to say no Excel. When those are plugged in, if I go to good ride like this, and this demo keeps clutching off all the time, your good ride's going to be at 100%. So in this example here, if there's no bar graph, that means those rows are going good. Now in this example, I've only got 3 rows that have good ride on them. Okay? So if my spacing's in tough shape, I'm going to look at my good ride. If it's close to 100%, it's not the issue. If my spacing's bad and my ride has gone down, then that tells me that, hey, what can I do? I can slow down. Okay? Maybe my downforce isn't high enough. If I'm not making good ground contact, I could be bouncing that row unit up and down, and that could be causing an issue. Now, if my spacing's bad and my SRI is bad, but my good ride is in good shape, there's probably something else causing the issue. But if my good ride metric is in good shape, okay, that's that tattletale to tell me I can rule out the ride issue. But if you do have those accelerometers or those SRMs that have the yellow light on there, we will probably falsely tell you that things are in good shape. So that's just a quick shout out on that to take a look at. Next year in the Gen 3s, we will be able to hopefully call out which rows have those SRMs that don't have an accelerometer, and we'll be able to tell it, hey, don't look at those rows for good ride. So check with your dealer on that to make sure that if you have that, you know how to work through that scenario. So this is what would happen if you're having good ride issues. So here the ride is nice and smooth, and you see how nice and even the spacing is. So now when I bring this other hand here, the meter's moving up and down. So the meter is still spinning the right RPMs, but the location of that meter at the time we let go of the seed is causing us to have that skip multiple look to it. But in reality, it's just a spacing issue. Okay, worn parallel arms are a big factor on that. Downforce, again, if my ground contact is not at 100%, that means that row unit's probably bouncing. The speed that we're traveling, the tillage angle that we went are all going to be big factors in working on my good ride metric. And we see again how that stacks up on here. Here's 100%, here's 90%. That's the only 10% drop, but look at how fast the data went for the yield. We were at a 200 bushel yield, and we dropped 20 bushels just because of 10% in our good ride. So you want to make sure that ride's good. That's why we talked about all those maintenance pieces earlier on. So if we know that, and we think of that metric, here's an example of some headlands where the planter was wider than his tillage, and so he makes 2 passes with a 36-row 66-foot planter, and so that's 132 feet, but his field cultivator is only 60, and he overlaps a little bit, and you can see how those headlands right here, right, the tillage was going the other way, and those rows really bounced. And so now that grower chose to then adjust his AB line and make a 3rd pass because he didn't want to lose all that, okay? Well, even on our farm, we have a simple 8-row planter, and a few years back in 2019, actually let me back up even further. So this area here, for most of my life, this was a cow pasture. It had never been farmed. And once the cows went down the road, we said, you know what, let's go ahead and start farming it. It is considered farmable wetland. I can't tile it. So every time we get too much of a rain, it really messes up our over here, and I like to do lots of different trials, as I mentioned. So I told Dad, I said, you know what, let's turn the tillage this way just for this little cow pasture, so that way we can we can kind of stop and manage our plots better. He said, sure. That was summer of 19. We get done combining, Dad gets out to do the tillage work out there, and guess what? He forgets about our discussion, and he just runs the regular tillage like normal. In the spring, he does tillage like normal. I get out there in the spring of 2020 to plant, and I go, uh-oh. I said, hey, Dad, we forgot to switch the tillage angle. And he goes, wow, we've got delta force, right? You should be fine. Just plant through it, right? Okay, here's my good ride map. You can see exactly what took place when I drove across the other direction from what he ran the tillage on, right? Pretty rough. What can we do if it's rough conditions? We can slow down. Here's my speed map, right? You can tell I was going only 4 miles an hour. I couldn't handle much more than 4 miles an hour planting across there, right? Okay, so let's bring up what did that look like when it came to my spacing map. Hey, spacing looks perfect. Okay, a Gen 3, we show SRI, not spacing. So on field view, it's going to say spacing, but that's not the right map. We need to look at SRI. Here's my SRI map. Okay, the way I've got the legend when I snap this one, you can see that we had some 18 to 21% SRI in here because of how we bounced across there, even at 4 miles an hour. Okay, I don't like that. Now you look over here, you can tell I got less than 12 on my SRI. Look at when I'm going the same direction as the tillage, okay? So we can manage that. Here's my downforce map. This is kind of a fun one, right? I can see exactly where the tractor went with the tillage. It all showed up. My downforce system felt all of that as I planted across there and was reacting accordingly. Here you can actually see my downforce. I did a trial of heavy, medium, lighter, and zero in the automatic. You can see some of that over here. But you can see exactly when I go across that tillage, it was showing up. It was reacting. We didn't have any loss of ground contact, right? I didn't have any blue dots on there. So I got planted to depth, but it was just kind of a rough one, okay? Now, here's my singulation. It doesn't look like it affected my singulation at all. I'm still in a 99% singulation for skips and multiples. So that looked pretty good. So now let's fast forward to 2022. Now we're doing the tillage the correct way, and look at my ride now. The only stuff I had was over here where again, we were doing a lot of our plots, so a lot of traffic going across here, but everything else looked really good. We cleaned that up because we went with the same degree as our tillage, okay? All right. So we've talked through population, singulation, and spacing, and now we kind of get to the depth discussion. So before we get into the downforce discussion, we want to think about a few different factors here. And so I always like to start the discussion on downforce with talking about our depths. And I show a picture here of where we take a measurement of where that seed goes to the crown, and we add 3/4 inch, and we know how deep this was. So in picture here, we see that he was at 1 3/4 inches. Okay, and I mention this because there's a lot of tillage done in our area up here, and a lot of times when I'm walking fields with you guys later in the summertime and I dig up, when I take that measurement, I'm only getting like, instead of getting 1 inch like this, I'm getting 3/4 inch or less. Which if you figure that, you say, Jason, that's only 1.5 inches deep. But wait a minute. I know I planted at 2 inches. I mean, I was out there, I had the seed digger, I was at 2 inches. I'm not disagreeing with you. What's taking place is after you're done planting, we catch a rain and that soil is collapsing some. And so before I go to assess how deep I'm planting, I like to take my foot and kind of step on where I've planted and firm that ground up a little bit and then dig, because I know that's what Mother Nature's going to deal me later on. Now, if you're in a no-till situation, that's probably not an issue. But if you're in conventional tillage, even some strip till, that's going to be part of the discussion as we talk through there. Okay? So, advantages of planting depth: we don't want to be too shallow. We want to be in the moisture. We don't want to be too deep where it's going to take us longer to come out of the ground. So we take a look here. Here it took 6.5 days to emerge, and there was an 11-day window from the first to the last one. And the range was because of the moisture. Over here, it took us only 2.5 days to emerge, but there was a 5.5-day window from the first to last. Here, even the 3-inch depth was still only 2.5 days to emerge, but it was a longer window because we had a little farther to go for some of these guys, right? It's this balancing act of depth. And I kind of start the downforce discussion with this because we've got to get our depth right, okay? We want to be in the moisture. This is some data from the AGCO crop tour, and he said, Jason, this doesn't look like there's a big range because we're averaging the information in. It depends on the year. If we don't get into moisture, this is from 2 years ago, I saw fields like this where we planted them and they just sat there until they finally got enough moisture to take off. That's a bad year, right? We don't get to fix that till next season. So we definitely got to be down in the moisture. In fact, we go back to those data points. If I single some of those areas out, look at this 2.5-inch range. 200, almost 220 bushels versus 205. 14 plus bushel because of a 1/2-inch difference. A lot of us just plant at 2 inches. I've seen a lot of your guys' planters where there's only 2 spots where that T-handle's ever lived at. Okay? Understand some differences there as we look across there. So, again, if we're using a smart firmer, we can start showing some differences between, hey, this is not enough moisture. This looks a little better. We go a little bit deeper. We go a little bit deeper. This is 2 inches, 2.25 inches, 2.5, and you can see how that acts in different soil types. We came back to yield, and we saw again 16 bushels for a 1/2 inch deeper. So we got to be to depth. Okay. That does bring us to some maintenance pieces real quick, is we got to make sure every row is the same. Now this is a simple 4-row planter, and yet when they planted, we saw such an unevenness when it come to emergence and found that there was 5/8 inch difference in the rotor variability in how deep they were. Because it was things like the mustache and the gauge wheel arms and the bolt through there that wore enough that there was discrepancy between there. So we need to make sure that we're zeroing the planter out. We want every row to do exactly what the neighboring rows are. So I know this is a little bit of maintenance, but we want to make sure we get this right. We want to be able to create a proper V-trench at the bottom. We don't want to have a W. You say, wait a second, Jason, why are we talking through all this for downforce? Because you can have your downforce correct, and if we don't do these things right, it's still going to give us a bad stand. Okay? Our opening is set right. Once you get a 1/2 inch of wear on them, it's time to replace them. Okay, we got all these different makes and manufacturers here. Most of us are 15-inch, Deere, Kenzie, early white planters. The newer case planters, Harvest International, are all 15-inch. Earlier case planters start at 14 inches, and then you've got the Fendt, Massey Ferguson's, and White 9000s are 15 3/4. All of them, when they get within a 1/2 inch less, measuring across here, it's time to replace them. We want to get them shimmed correctly. Take our business card here. When they make contact, make your mark. How much contact? The thicker the blade, the less contact we have. We don't want to take out that bearing in the center. Okay? Case IH ones, they have one that leads, one that follows. You want an 1/8 inch gap, right? I don't care for these really thick ones. They seem to be fairly blunt on the end. I typically like these ones in here. Just understand, what are you working with? Get them set accordingly. All right, zeroing the planter out, like I mentioned, we want to go ahead and put some blocks underneath there and set it so everything's the same. And so when we take a look at it, every time we move that handle is a 1/4 inch on these systems. Some you have a screw adjust. So in here on the case, you can screw adjust in or out. I don't really care which model you have. We got to make sure that every row is the same. So we go ahead and we take some blocks. I like doing 2 inch. A lot of us are planting 2 inches in depth. And you set the planter down, make it so once it touches, and then let me back up a few spots. Then you're going to go ahead and get so that handle gets locked in, and take a metal marker and put a dot on both sides. And do that all the way across the planter. You'd be surprised how many rows are not the same and how much variation you have. Okay, now just because we set it for 2 inches, does that mean we're 2 inches in the field?
No, you sit in that tillage that we've done, it's going to sit a little bit deeper. Typically it's about a 1/4 inch shallower, I find, okay? But at least I have a reference value going across, and I can make those adjustments across the planter. So we're still going to validate in the soil when we get going. Now if I have a system like here, we've got the adjustment here, I can dial it so that they're all the same. Same with this other style, the case row unit 2, right? I can adjust those so that they're all the same. That way, as I make my changes, it will be the same all the way across the planter. All right, here you can kind of see what it looks like on a Kenzie unit. Let me set that down, okay? So now that we got depth all the same, now when it comes to how we're going to set this guy, we're going to keep talking about the soil density management, right? That's earlier on when I said when we were checking depth, when we step down and we kind of firm that up, we're talking about how much pore space do we have, okay? So when we think through that, we take a cut of the soil, we want half of that to be our solids of our mineral matter, our organic matter, and the other half to be pore space, which is divided between air and moisture. That's what we want to try to get it correct, okay? So now as we think through this, that starts off with the sidewall. That's where we're talking about this load bearing of the gauge wheels. We will also include then our seed firming in our closing, but the first part that we're going to spend a next chunk of time with is that sidewall. So, if you're watching this, you have either a Gen 1, Gen 2, or Gen 3. You have at least 3 load cells that are giving you information in the cab of what's taking place. This one's actually in running right now, right? Those load cells are telling what's the weight on those gauge wheels. We see the high and the low rows, okay? You may or may not have a system that is managing that. If you are just watching, you have to make adjustments to your, maybe you got airbags and manual airbags, maybe you got side springs, okay? If you've got something like Air Force or you've got Delta Force, now you have some controlling factors, but the principles still play true for all of you folks, right? Everybody's got at least 3 of these guys, if not 1 on every row, that is doing this reading this information in, okay? And it's this balancing act between ground contact and margin. Ground contact meaning that I have at least some weight on there, and then margins, a lot of times you guys get to say, hey, margin's really confusing, okay? So instead of margin, think of that as firming force. When we think about the goals of the weight that we have on the row unit, okay? There are 2 main things we're looking to do. We need enough weight to push down, like we said, to get to depth. I set my depth adjustment for 2 inches. I need to have enough weight pushing down that we actually get the opening disc to where it needs to be. The second thing that we need is I need enough firming force, or like we used to call margin, or kind of call margin yet, because I'm trying to keep that soil from falling in to the bottom, right? I need to get the seed to the bottom first before I try to close things up. And so the amount of force we use is part of that equation. Now, if we go back to 2015, that was a little bit more of a drier spring, if some of us remember that. It started off okay, but as the season went on, we just never got a rain, We had a gentleman that I got the phone call from the dealer and was, hey, we ran our down system super heavy and we still had seed on top of the ground. And when we got out there and we started looking, we dug down and we had our trench at 2 inches. It was later in the season. Everybody was pretty much done planting. He was just getting his soybeans in. The trench was at 2 inches, but the seed was on top of the ground. What took place is that ground on top was so fluffy with residue and the top ground was so dried out, no matter how hard we pushed down, there wasn't enough moisture to hold that soil. We actually we were caving in the soil instead of holding it to the side. We had to take the row cleaners, make them more aggressive, and get this fluffiness out of there so we had enough moisture that the gauge wheel would actually hold the seed trench open to get the seed to the bottom. So I just don't want us to have tunnel vision when we think through this. Everything's connected, right?
Now, again, I'm giving this from the Minnesota perspective where we don't typically plant in too dry conditions. It's usually too wet. But who would have thought, well, we'll see what the way the weather cleans up. But last fall, it was really dry. Depending on how things look, we weren't sure if we were going to have an average moisture year. We'll still have to see how things pan out here as things warm up this spring. Okay, so firming force. Instead of margin, think of firming force. Okay? Now, most of you guys show up and are like, Jason, just tell me where to set it at. Okay? That's why I came to class, is just tell me where to punch it in on the 2020 and where's the happy number at? Well, it depends, right? There's not a single number. So I am going to go ahead and play this video. Corey Mulbauer is one of our R&D agronomists, and he is part of that video series I mentioned on the planter maintenance, and he's going to talk about downforce management here.
Talk to you guys about furrow structural integrity and its relationship to the downforce target setting that you choose on your planter. We had a lot of beautiful weather this fall, and it gave us an opportunity to spend an extra amount of time out in the field. I took that chance to do some open furrow examples of how that relationship of downforce and furrow quality interact. Notice the planter in the picture. We've got the closing wheels tied up on most of the rows, so we're going to take this opportunity to look at the seed furrows that we've developed here. Furrow structural integrity, what I mean by that is the goal of a good seed furrow is to have a clean, open, and consistent environment for each and every seed. What we want is equal moisture, equal temperature, and good, consistent soil density for all the seeds so that we achieve that uniform germination and emergence that we strive for optimum yield potential. Here's an example of downforce target setting too heavy for these conditions. The first thing you notice is on the surface of the ground, there's a very pronounced gauge wheel footprint that we can visually see there. That's your first indication that the gauge wheels are carrying quite a bit of weight. The average gauge wheel weight for this pass was 300 pounds on the gauge wheels. But yet, look inside the furrow. The good thing about carrying this amount of weight is we're achieving a very clean, open seed furrow environment. So I know I'm going to have good, consistent environment for each and every seed in that furrow. The problem with carrying this much weight is when you use your digging tool and you pick along the sides of the seed furrow, you can feel how dense and compact that soil is. Carrying 300 pounds of gauge wheel weight is a lot of weight for a lot of soil environments. Like here, we've created quite a bit of compaction, and this is going to be a problem with our closing system and its ability to put this soil back together and have a good environment for seeds to grow in and root development later on. Here's an example of downforce target too light for the planting conditions. What do you notice is different here? The furrow is 3/4 of the way shut already. What happened is, with no closing systems engaged, the furrow actually collapsed in on itself. Because our down pressure is only about 30 pounds of weight carried on the gauge wheels, that left this furrow environment too loose. And we lost the integrity of the sidewalls and they caved in. And what caves in around that seed is dry soil and clods, and that creates an inconsistent environment for germination emergence, and we're not going to achieve the uniform moisture and temperature that we strive for to get that optimum stand. When you dig around in that soil, you can just feel how loose it is, and it's just another way to tell. The gauge wheel imprint is non-existent. Like in the heavier setting where we could see right where the tire ran, when your gauge wheels are too light, you'll struggle to find their imprint on the surface of the ground. In this example, we've got the downforce target set just right for the conditions. We're carrying about 100 pounds on the gauge wheels, and that happens to be about the optimum range to be in for this type of planting environment. We're achieving that good, clean, open furrow environment where we can achieve consistency seed to seed when it comes to moisture and temperature and soil density. You can see the gauge wheel imprint, which we want to see a little bit, just not overpronounced. So seeing the gauge wheel imprint is a good thing, meaning that we are carrying a little bit of weight on the gauge wheel tires. When we dig alongside this furrow, our digging tool easily pokes into the ground. We can see movement of the soil as we poke at it. We go inside the furrow and do a little bit of lifting, and you can see it crumble and fall apart. This is a good sign. You can have confidence, if this is the open furrow environment you're seeing, that your closing system is going to be able to do a good job of closing this seed furrow, achieving good density around the seed, having good emergence and good root development later on. So let's remember, as you're setting your downforce target, you want to think about, are you choosing the optimum gauge wheel weight for the planting conditions that you're in? You want to achieve good furrow structural integrity, meaning a clean, open, and consistent seed environment in your planting conditions. You can use your downforce target as a tool. If planting conditions get drier, it's going to be harder to hold that sidewall, so you probably need to have a higher down pressure target. And that's okay, because compaction is not a risk in dry conditions. When you get into wetter planting conditions, you probably need to choose a lower downforce target, because now compaction is a high risk problem, and it's going to be easy to hold an open furrow sidewall in a wetter condition. So now you know you can use your downforce target setting to help control your furrow structural integrity. Use it to make sure that you get an optimum seed furrow environment for best germination and emergence uniformity for the planting conditions that you have.
All right, so here's an example. A couple years ago when I went out and we took the closing system up out of the way. We just right? We too heavy? We too light? What are you thinking? Too heavy, right? We see these big chunks coming off as we poke. That's how I want you guys to figure out, just like Corey was showing on there, that's the right way to figure out where that number's at. Okay, we do have some of these tools, if you're interested, where we take that closing system, put it in neutral, hook up, get it out of the way. Ratchet straps work. They're a little bit more cumbersome in that, but identify how does that trench look, right? Do I need to go heavier? Do I need to go lighter? So we're going to spend some time on that a little bit here. This plus and minus thing. So if you've been in any of my clinics, we always got to go over this because it's a big part of it. The plus is going down. And Corey talked a little bit about it, right? We've got the weight of the row unit itself. In this case, we got a box for seed, we got a box for insecticide. You know, either you got an airbag, side spring, or hydraulic cylinder. You have something that's aiding to pushing down. It's getting that weight. When it pushes down, where's it getting weight from? The bar, right? So it depends on the planter you have. But the part you also got to remember is we're trying to overcome this soil. We've got row cleaners. We've got opening discs set at X depth. We've got gauge wheels, we've got closing systems. They're all making contact with the soil, and that has its own set of parameters and properties that we're trying to overcome. And so let's just, let's make it a little bit simpler. I'll make it a 3-bushel box. Let's say that unit, I'm going to move this a little bit here, narrow this up just a bit. Let's say 200 pounds is the weight of that row unit itself, just the raw weight of things before we put anything in it. Let's put 3 bags of seed in there. I've got 150 pounds of seed. And then let's say that the spring settings, I'm going to use easy math. Let's say that we're at 150 pounds of down pressure taking place. These are all pushing downward, and these are my pluses, okay? So that gives me a total of 500 pounds that we're working with, pushing down on the plus side. But what I got to also remember is what's my minus. So as all these things like I talked about are coming in contact with the soil, there's an amount of resistance there. Let's say that right now there's 400 pounds of resistance. That leaves me with 100 pounds of positive weight left over, right? Because these are pushing back up. Now Corey said in his video, right, 100 was a pretty good spot. And I'd say that's a great starting spot when we look at information on the 2020 system, okay? Now, if we plant out, let's say we plant out 100 pounds so far, I still got 50 pounds of seed in there. If everything else stays the same, that's a big if, right? If everything else stays the same, now I've got 400 pounds here, this goes to 0, this is going to continue to drop down. And when it gets to 0 here, first of all, I can't show you that on a scale, right? So once it gets to 0 and it goes less than that, over here on the side, when you see, okay, here's my weight on the low, on the gauge wheels, my ground contact's going to go away from 100%. Those load cells are reading 200 times a second. We can't fathom that, right? That's things bouncing up and down, whatever. But when I cannot have any leftover weight, our ground contact's going to start coming away from 100%. I'm also guessing once that happens, what's my ride going to do? It's going to start jumping around. Now when that starts jumping around, what's that going to do? We just talked about it. My SRI and my good spacing metric are going to start going to heck because now we're bouncing that seed around going down the seed tube. Okay? So we got to have some weight there. Now you say, okay, a bunch of you guys have center fill planters. Now the soil conditions doesn't change because of what planter you have, but now I have less weight again. Right? So all of a sudden now I'm at 350 pounds. Now I'm a negative 50. Right? This is going to be a train wreck. So far all we're doing is talking about the weight pushing down. So I would have to take either my side springs, my airbag, or my hydraulic cylinder, right? And I need to make an adjustment to bring this back into play where I want to be. So you're going to have to run heavier just to balance this equation out. So now I have to bring this back up to 300 pounds in order to get back to my 100-pound target. Okay? So far, all we've been talking about is the plus side. We haven't been talking about what's happening down on the soil level on the minus side. That minus side, there's a lot of factors that go into that. So let's just, I get a little ahead of myself. Let's go ahead and look at a map of, here's the boxes that when they're full, they're on the heavy side of that equation, and as we plant out, we get to this loss of ground contact. We fill the planter back up when we're heavy, and we go to we're light. Okay? You're going to have to figure out where am I going to set those airbags or springs if I'm just a watch it only, and where's that happy medium spot. Here is a graph again of that ground contact at 100%. As soon as we get off 100%, here we're only at 90%, and we already lost 10 bushels. Don't like to see a lot of loss of ground contact, okay? So let's take a look at what other factors could be. There's things in the environment. What's the temperature like? Okay, if it gets so cold, what's that ground going to do? It's going to tighten up. There's going to be more resistance. How about soil type? Is everybody's fields the same soil type all the way across, or is there differences? Those opening discs are going to have different amounts of resistance based on what the soil texture is. Okay. Also, how much moisture do we have? Corey alluded to it in the video. When it's dry, I don't have to worry about compaction, but there's a lot more resistance involved. So where does my target have to be, or where do I want to hit? What's it going to take to hit that? So let's kind of play through that a little bit on a few of these maps here. So we've got a box planter here as we take a look at, and you can see as he did the headlands first, and when I grabbed this shot I missed a little bit here, but you can see here we're on the kind of in this happy zone of in the green and yellow area, and then he fills the planter back up, and now we're a little heavy, but notice right here we see we're a little bit further down on the color chart versus here we're in the 200 plus. This difference here, that's your soil type change, right? He's still driving back and forth the same speed. Now he is going lighter because the boxes are getting lighter, but here's your soil type difference. He's not making any changes. The system is what it is, and you can see that swing there is about 100 pounds the way it looks on this map. Now, this same grower, the same exact setup, plants this field within a day of the last field, and it looks quite different, doesn't it? Here all of a sudden we start seeing a lot of loss of ground contact. We don't see anything on the heavy side. Oh, maybe a little bit over here, but for the most of the field there's a lot of blue in there. In general, I'm going to say this field is too light. But if I have to consider the last 2 years, in our area last spring we were probably on the wetter side, okay? So now if I had to consider these two fields, which one do I think he got it right at? Field A or field B? Field B or field A? I've gone to eye doctor quite a bit, and I kind of feel like I took lessons from the eye doctor there, right? Which one do you like better? Depends. When it was wet last spring, I was probably a little bit more concerned about these red areas of carrying too much extra firming force. Okay? I'm worried about compaction. Although This is a lot of blue. I probably still don't want this much blue even last year, okay? But if it's wet, I can't have compaction. Now, on the flip side, if we go 2 years ago, when it was a little bit on the drier spring, especially if I'm aggressive with my tillage and stuff like that, I'm not worried about the excess weight when it's dry, because that's going to carry that quite well for me. So some of that does depend on the season. Okay? But the difference of these pictures you're seeing here, this happened to be corn on corn. So his tillage conditions were a little bit rougher. So when he was watching his ride, okay, to make his ride and spacing good, he slows down. He slows down and he has more weight available to those gauge wheels. When he goes faster, because this was corn on soybean ground, it was smoother. He says, you know what, I can push it faster, and my SRI, my good ride, my spacing, they still look really good, so he picks it up a gear. Unfortunately, what happened is we started losing our ground contact. Okay? Everything's connected. Now, depending on the year, depends on which one was probably right. Okay? What equipment do we have? I'm showing some center fill planters here. This one's even mounted. Okay, when we have to turn this downforce, whether it's our spring, airbag, or delta, our hydraulic cylinder, and apply more weight, where's it getting its weight from? It has come from the planter bar. So if I got a 30-inch pull-type planter versus a 20-inch 3-point mounted planter, which one has more weight available? 30-inch pull-type, right? So can I transfer? If I ask for enough weight, do I have it there? I've had those of you guys in class that run a mounted planter and said, hey, I have to tell it to stop at a certain point. Why? Because it lifts the whole planter up and it hits the lift switch. Okay? Because I don't have enough weight. That doesn't mean I shouldn't. I don't have the resources to do it. Okay? So here's an example of, in the center of the planter, we're happy. We've got excess weight, but on the wings, we're light. We go out and scout this later on, and we've got gaps, not because seed didn't get planted, it didn't get planted in the moisture, and it didn't come up, and we saw the yield loss there. So we want to make sure, guys, the planter is looking nice and straight at us here. Once we put seed and fertilizer in the planter, if we don't have these markers, is our planter smiling at us? We got to get that bar nice and level. Maybe it's making adjustments here. Maybe it's we got to add more ballast. Okay, do we got to add weights to the end so that the system can operate the way it needs to? If I call for extra weight, I have to have some place to get it from. Okay? Some guys have even gone to a point where they've had to make modifications to get those wings down so it ain't smiling. I need those row units to have full motion to be able to function properly. Here's another example. This was another center fill planter, and here's the width of the planter. In the center, we see a lot of lower numbers, even loss of ground contact, but the wings are good. You say, Jason, you just said the opposite. Well, what's taking place close to the center of that planter? We've got wheel compaction, right? So here's an example years before, where here we've got duals on the tractor, duals in the front, triples in the back, and look at how when we pinch down, we have more minus because of this compaction here versus the rest. So we have different conditions that we're trying to balance as we go throughout. In this example here, we would have had to put side springs on top. These were an airbag planter, it was an Air Force planter all the way across. We needed more plus here and less on the outside. It gets hard to balance out. Okay? If we talk about Air Force on the 2020, we're talking Gen 1, Gen 2s. We need to go into the Air Force box. We need to turn the system on. We enable control. And we have this range because it's an average of all the load cells going across the planter. We need to make sure that there's air in the compressor. The system will go into a hold zone if this gets so low. It's going to say, hey, I don't have enough air to make changes. It puts it in a hold pattern. Okay, now it's got upset at me here because we need to make sure and zero the load cells out, which is a good point to bring up for everybody here. So we're just going to go ahead and flip back and forth real quick. I'm going to switch this. Switch him back to the 2020. So those load cells, in order to read correctly, Looks like I gotta hit the button one more time here. Here we go. In order to zero those load cells out, on the Gen 1 and 2s, we're going to go to Setup. And on the top here, we're going to go to Systems. And yours is going to say RUMs or load cells. And you click on that, and this one's got one off. In the demo, every time I turn it on, it goes back to that. You click on Stats, it's going to make them active. We need at least 3 functioning load cells to make Air Force work. They're reading right. You want to lift the planter up, and when the planter's lifted, you're going to hit 0 all. When it's lifted up, these values here should be around 0. If they're up a little bit or down a little bit, no big deal. A few pounds isn't so bad. When you start getting double digits is when I'm going to say we want to do it again. Now on the Gen 3, we're going to go Setup. We're going to go to Data. Oops, excuse me. Diagnose. And then we're going to go to downforce, and there's going to be load cells. Now mine are going to say missing because I'm not plugged into a planter right now, but here's my 0 all sensors. Okay, again, when the planter is lifted, we're going to do that and zeroes it all out. If we have the planter in the ground and we hit 0, that's like standing on the bathroom scale and running it to 0. That's cheating, right? So we zero out the planter, look for some discrepancies. If you've got some numbers in here that just keep trailing up where it says 999 or minus 999, even though you're not moving and things, we probably have a compromised load cell. Check the wires. You'll probably have to change out the load cell itself. Once you put the new load cell in, go back in here and zero all out. I like to do it between crops. I know some of you like to do it even between fields. That might be a bit excessive. Okay, but that's going to help make sure that the system's going to function the way it needs to. Now, if you are running Air Force or Delta Force and you get one that's a little funky, the system might kick it out and say, hey, this one's so off compared to the rest, it's going to go to inactive. Or you can even take your finger and tap on the status and say, hey, do you want to disable this one? And if I say yes, it will turn it off. Now, it will look at the rest of the rows and make those determinations for like Air Force or Delta Force accordingly. Okay? But you can go ahead and tap on it again. We'll turn this one back on, and it should allow my Air Force to now function. I have to go in Air Force every time and turn it on to get the system healthy and running. With Delta Force, once I turn it on, I shouldn't have to go back in there and change it. Okay? Now this one's under manual right now. Standard's going to have you right there. I tend to run a little heavier when I'm starting. So if I go to custom, now I can move this range around. I can make it more aggressive or less aggressive. I can squeeze it tighter or widen it out depending on what I want to do. I tend to make my air compressor work a little harder. I tend to like to start in that, actually I go right about here, 60 to 100 pound range. Okay? And then I'm going to do just like Corey showed, evaluate the trench, see if I have to make some changes or not. Okay? So that's on the Air Force side of things. On Delta Force, you're going to have downforce over here. Now my demo's not going to like it. It has me, you don't want it, so you have to go to enable the system, all the different systems you got to go to enable, and then you go to target automatic, and you got standards 100. 100 pounds is a great place to start at. Your system pressure needs 2,500 PSI from your tractor to function correctly. You can then hit the plus or minus, or use your, see now it kicked out because it doesn't see the stuff on it. Or you can grab and actually move your target around accordingly. Okay? That's how you're going to set up. It's going to be very similar on the Gen 2 here. Now it's going to get mad at me because the demo does not have Delta Force on it. But same time, now it's just a very single setting. Again, standard's going to be 100 pounds. And from there, now it kicked it out because it says, hey, you don't actually, I'm not seeing it. Yep, that's fine. Okay? But you're going to move that up and down accordingly. Okay? All right. With that in place, let's bring this back into the PowerPoint. All right, we talked about that picture. All right, so when we start getting more and more load cells, we see more and more variation take place. This happens to be a previous planter that we owned that was Air Force. It was a red planter. A few things we'll talk about that, but first of all, Air Force does average all the sensors across there. So even though it's an 8-row planter, I had 8 load cells on there. First of all, with the RED tire on there, being a case planter, and I'll get a picture of that in a little bit, I want to carry a heavier target. My leftover target, instead of being 100 pounds, I'm going to want that to be like 120, 130 starting out because of the tire. And I'll show you that tire here in a little bit. So you'll notice my map overall is yellow with some green and some orange. I'm running a bit higher on my margin or firming force. But you notice here, we had row 5 got hung up. We hit a rock and it got hung up. And look at how when there was a 0, look at what my average here is, right? It averaged 0 and it hit that same target. It kept pushing down so that we still averaged that number, and it got a lot heavier at that point, okay? Here's that RED tire I'm talking about. So on the case, we're carrying that weight that we're seeing over on the edge, so that soil density, there's that RED tire, and so because of that soil density is fluffier here, you guys with the red machines need to run a 30-pound, 20 to 30 pounds heavier than everybody else just to compensate for that. It's just a physics thing, okay? Nothing wrong with that row unit. You just need to run a little bit heavier to compensate for that, okay? So with that in mind, we look at things like compaction we talked about before. And again, you could see on our farm that I mentioned earlier, you can see all the wheel traffic. I had to have a high enough target that as I go across this variation, I don't see blue dots showing up. Over here you see a little bit. He carried a lot more, right? He's running heavy because the tillage was done at this angle and he planted this way. He chose to go heavy. He wasn't concerned about compaction because he wanted to minimize loss of ground contact. Okay? So some other examples of how this minus changes in the soil conditions. Here's tillage. Up here is no-till. Down here is tillage. Here the system, when we talk about Delta or Air Force, this bottom number becomes your target, right? That we talked about setting up that target. And so now this becomes a plus-minus factor because we are now in control of what we're doing with this number. We kind of flip it on its head. So to hit X number, we're going to change this. So as this minus changes, we can run with it to hold that margin or firming force that we want. But look at here with the tillage. That drops so low that we're having to lift versus in the no-till, we're pushing down 500 pounds. This is over a 500-pound swing in this minus number because of tillage. So type of tillage, depth of tillage, right? What if I run my field cultivator at 2 inches? All right, so tillage depth. Do we want to be doing tillage at the same depth as what we are planting at? I would say not, right? Because what's the minus at 2 inches and above versus what's the minus at 2 inches and below when we're doing our tillage at this? That density is going to be different, right? There's going to be more resistance below where that field cultivator shovel went versus where it was on the top side. So that's going to change the minus number as well. Now, I'm not telling you guys you have to do a lot of deep tillage. I'm saying we need to be deeper than what we're planting at or shallower than what we're planting at so we can manage that downforce correctly so that we, again, stay at depth when we're planting, okay? So here's an example of downforce out in South Dakota in 2015 when it's dry, and you can see we cannot get weight on the row units. We have a lot of loss of ground contact. He parks it, and it rains like 1.5 inches, and 2 days later he's able to start planting. That's how dry they were before the rain. And so after the rain, he goes and he starts planting, and life's good. We're in the right range, okay? So what you don't see in the background is what the system's doing. So here is the map of what Delta Force did. So before the rain, we have maxed out the system. We pushed down as much as we can, and we still couldn't hit target. But after the rain, it's enough moisture that we're actually lifting 60 pounds. So we have a swing of about 500 some pounds because of 1.5 inches of rain. Okay, so that minus number changed that much. Now we're still trying to hit for a target, and we do a pretty good job on the rest of this. This is a pretty healthy map when I look at it. Okay, not so much the headlands, but that's just how much moisture can play a part of that plus minus discussion. We take a look at this field. This was also in 2015. This is one of my dealers, and he took over this farm 3 years prior to that. And so before he took over, this farm was farmed north and south. And so the first thing he did was he turned the direction and started farming it east and west. And so for 3 years, in the fall it got disc ripped east and west. In the spring it would get field cultivated east and west. It'd get planted east and west for 3 seasons. And so he goes into his downforce settings, and he wanted to do a trial. And how a lot of times we do trials is we go into manual, and we would set this at 0, and he makes this pass here, and you can see all this loss of ground contact. This is a 24-row DB44 22-inch row planter, and you see all this loss of ground contact, okay? In fact, it was so bad that halfway through he went and bumped it up 50 pounds. And then he went and did all these other settings, and look at here. Here it's really heavy. We see all this excess weight through here. And it came time for spraying, and he noticed these gaps, so we flew the drone over, and you see these big gaps. This is 44 feet going across here, and you see these big gaps because there was no weight on those gauge wheels, okay? Versus these other rows where we had the excess weight, it was so dry that we didn't cause any issues here, but the meters planted, we just did not get to depth, we did not get to moisture, and therefore we didn't with any viable plants there. Now the other thing I think is interesting with all that tillage east and west, still while we're planting 2 inches deep, we can still see north-south compaction layers that was in the field. The planter still felt that at 2 inches planting depth while planting, some compaction from multiple years prior to that. We take this to yield, and you can see on the yield map when we match these maps up, it was a 40 bushel hit in 15 because of this loss of ground contact. Now where we had the excess weight didn't really cost us anything that year because of how dry it was. We go to 2016, probably more of an average moisture year for us in Minnesota. This was about another 30 miles away from the last field, and he's got also a 24-row, 22-inch planter. And so we're showcasing with a hybrid map, but he goes into manual again and sets it at 375, 250, 125, 0, and automatic. Look at here, the 0 and the automatic almost look the same. Because we had more moisture, that resistance is a lot less, and that year the weight of the row unit was enough for us to achieve ground contact. We take this year to yield, and the 2 excess of weight, the 375 and the 250s were costing us yield versus the automatic, the 0 and the 125. So again, if we go into our system when it's running here, we can see on the diagnose page on a Gen 3, we can see what the pressure was commanded, what the force we're actually applying, the net force that was left over based on what we're asking the system to do. Okay? So it all depends upon the conditions of where I'm going to set my down pressure. If it's drier, we're going to move that target up. If it's wetter, we're going to try it down. Okay? All right. So that's going to switch us over into the clutching side of things. So when we think about clutching, we want to make sure that we get our prescriptions in there and everything reads accordingly. We want our shutoffs and that to run correctly. We want to make sure we get things calibrated. So we're achieving exactly what we want. So I mentioned earlier we would go through this again for bringing prescriptions in. Again, we would go from our home page, we would click on Setup. By clicking on the Setup side of things, it brings us into this page here. We go to the Data tab. Once we click that data, we're going to go from Export to Import. We're going to bring in prescriptions. And once again, as it's seeding, we bring in a seeding. It brings us in. Here's our shape files we've got. We select them. Normal processing is what most of us are going to do. We're going to hit Import. It's going to say that they're inside and ready to go. Okay? I'm going to switch this guy over to the live. Oops. Okay. On the Gen 2 we mentioned earlier, again, just for refresher, Setup, Data tab, Import, Prescriptions. We read those in, and now when it comes time to execute, we'll need to make sure that we go ahead and select field. We bring in field on the field name, prescription. We set the attribute. There's our population there. We hit enter. Prescription is loaded. Okay? So we've got our prescriptions inside. So when we go to the field, if we are running V-Drive or RowFlow, you have your switches on your system. You have your first one on the left is the master plant. Your three middle ones need to be in the planting, the middle position. If they are down, your lights, your LEDs will be red. You want them in that middle position. And then your last switch is your swathing switch on and off. Okay? So I will say, again, as we think about rolling into the field, when it comes to swathing, we always want to consider when we back up, that 2020 is making a determination where that planter is based on that, where that GPS globe and those measurements are that we talked about earlier. The longer you back up, so let's say I got a red tractor and a green planter, which is actually how we run in our operation. The longer you back up, it might get confused as to where that planter is. Now, you and I might know that we put the planter right nice tucked in the corner here, right? But if it on the map thinks it's like this and you take off, you're going to get kind of a spot here like that, right? Where it thinks you were there as you plant, and then what happens when you come through the next pass, it's going to think that area is already planted and clutch off. So when we do the headland, especially if we're doing any backing up, I want to pay attention to what does that map look like, and I'm going to keep my auto swath, that last switch on the end, off as I back up in the corners and take off. Once I know I'm in the area and I've been past that, I can switch that auto swath switch on so it clutches correctly. Okay? So as we back ourselves up in the corner, we're going to take off. We set the planter down. What we're going to go ahead and do is we got to prime those meters. So we got our vacuum system on, or positive air if we are, right? And those middle three switches, we're going to take the first and the third one, and we're going to just bump them up. If we bump them up, it's going to load those meters. Let's see if I can get this one to showcase it. Nope, it's not going to on mine. All right, so when you tap those, we do need to go ahead and turn our seating system on. I do have that on. Our prescription's on. What are we going to clutch on to? We'll talk about that here in just a second. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to bump those switches. And when we bump those switches, it's going to load the meters. You might get a pop-up that says all meters are loaded. That means you're good to go. If you get a pop-up and it says, hey, row 5 failed to load, that means we did not see any seed come by row 5. There's no seed on there. So you're probably going to go ahead and do what? You're going to take those switches, you're going to bump them again. And if it does the same thing again, guess what? There's probably something wrong with row 5. We get out, and sure enough, the vacuum hose was not attached to the meter. We attach the vacuum hose. We feel we've got that taken care of, right? We get back in the cab. What do we got to do? We got to load it one more time because there's still no seed on row 5. So we bump it one more time. All rows are loaded. Okay, we know we have seed on the meters. When we set the planter down and take off going forward, if you are row flow, you're going to have a button that says low start speed. If you're V-drive, I'm going to switch mine to my layout that I use on our farm. You're going to have a quick start button. This will say quick start on the Gen 2 if you're running V-drive instead of low start speed. What we need to see to drop seed is we have to see forward speed. There is an accelerometer that says yes, there is movement on the planter. There is radar. There is GPS. GPS only sends us information of how fast we are going 5 times a second. Radar does 50 to 60 times a second. So on row flow, when we click on low start speed, it's going to say, hey, I'm not going to worry about anything else. As soon as I see that accelerometer's got forward momentum, I'm going to start spinning those hydraulic motors. Okay? So when I tap it, when I start moving, it's going to go ahead and turn that system on. If I'm V-drive, this countdown, when it's blinking active, it is spinning the meters at 3 miles an hour until it sees a speed source. As soon as it sees radar or GPS, it's going to switch to that speed. So that's only when you're at a complete stop and you take off. All right? So having said that, you would hit those buttons accordingly to take off from a dead stop when you're backed up. Now, if I'm in the middle of the field, and I stop and I'm going to pick up a rock, I put it in the rock box, I take off again, what I want you to do is lift the planter up, back up 10 feet, drop the planter down, and take off so that it turns on at the right time, and it should not leave you with any kind of a gap. If it is, it'll be pretty small, right? Now, you do have to understand that when you come to a stop, right, when you're pushing the clutch in, you will probably get some seed that piles up. I've had one gentleman say, Jason, I know how to fix that. Before I come to a stop, I turn my master plant switch off, and then I push the clutch in. That works only if you remember to what? When I back up, I got to turn the switch back on. I tried this a couple years ago, and I found that I'm not very good about turning my switch back on. Okay? So all of a sudden, I stop in the middle of the field here. One of these times I'm going to remember this green marker's done. So if I come to a stop here, right? And then I back up, and if I don't turn my switch back on, I keep going, and now I'm over here, and I'm like, the monitor's not beeping at me. Why? Because my master plant switch is off, so it knows it's not supposed to plant, right? And all of a sudden, now I figure out, oh crap, I forgot to turn the switch back on. Now, if I back up all this, now it gets confused, so now we're in a big trouble. So now we're going to have to actually make a loop back around, right, and come back up again, which brings up another good point for swathing, okay? Row 5 runs out of seed, okay? Now this depends on how fast you guys are at hitting the clutch. So if I run out of seed, I push the clutch in, I lift up, if I back up nice and straight, and I set the planter back down, and I get seed back into row 5, and I auto load my meters again, so there's seed in row 5, right? Now when I go back through, it'll feed in, and it'll fill that spot in. What you gotta watch out for, guys, is when you back up, if you get off like this, and I take off, even though you have the planter in the right spot, if you back up too far and it gets off like this, when you take off again, the wrong row is going to turn off and I'll still have a gap there. So if you get too far ahead, once again, you're going to have to probably make that turnaround and then come back in so the GPS is right so it does fill that in the way we want. Okay? All right. So that's our clutching on that side of things. And what are we going to clutch off of? That is going to be our control plan. So we're going to click on row floor V-drive. This will look the same, just the word on top will be different. And then you got your swathing over here. On the Gen 3, we go to seeding. And over here we've got our swath control plan. What are we going to swath off of? The things in green are what we're going to swath to. Notice I've got field boundary off. If my boundaries aren't perfect and I hang that planter over just a little bit, right? If I have this turned on, it's going to clutch the outside of my planter off. I don't want to do that. So I typically turn the field boundary off on there. Over here it's on, right here on the side here, control plan. We simply tap on field boundary. We are going to still clutch on inner boundaries, map coverage where I've been, and if I decided I want to do simulated headlands. That's totally up to you if you want to use that, right? To lock these in, we hit Save Control Plan. Same thing over here, we hit OK. All right. Now, as long as we're in here, what are we going to control to? Now, I've got a prescription already loaded, so we're already doing variable rate control. If I tap on him and it goes to manual, here's my 8 set points that we did on the earlier page. On the Gen 3, we've got our set points on the side. On the Gen 3, these are specific for the crop. So since I'm in corn, these 8 are for corn. If I go into soybeans, I'll have 8 set points specifically for soybeans. Okay? Now, if I back up a step here, I do have a prescription in place. If I want to take a look at it, I click on this arrow, the arrows to the corner. It brings in that nice simple prescription I talked about earlier. If you want to edit your prescriptions, okay, we can go back into prescription edit over here. I have to make sure the attribute is correct. Here's my prescription. On the Gen 2, you've got AutoMap Express. When you click there, it brings in your prescription. Again, depends on how complicated. If you have a very complex prescription, you might not see it rendered here at all. It might still show up, or it'll still execute to it, but it might say too many polygons to render. Okay, same thing on the Gen 3. We can handle a lot more. We can execute a high number compared to what we can show you on the screen. Okay? So if I want to make changes, edit existing zones. Now, when we first developed AutoMap Express, it was based on soil type. So it's going to pop up this soil type legend on here. Just hit OK. You're going to probably have to select all soil types, but it's actually talking about the shape file you have. And now I can make a change to it by up or down or by a percentage. Same thing over here on this side. Select all zones, bump up and down, change by percentage. When I get done, I hit save, okay? And again, it's got that prescription in there. Or I go to manual, and then my population pops up here. Okay? One thing I will mention over here, if you are running smart firmers and you want to use organic matter control, that is right over here. Right now it is disabled. But right now I'm at 33,000. So if I go into organic matter control, we can do it on the Gen 2 as well. If I'm running V-Drive, this demo is not doing this, but you can do the same thing. You have your organic matter numbers on the side here. These are adjustments, not the actual population. Okay? So if I go to population on the side here, and I turn this on, if I am less than 1.5%, and you can change these values, it will do whatever you say here. So I said, if it's less than this, I want to drop it by 6,000. If it's between 1.5 and 3, I'm going to take my base rate, which right now is 33,000. I'm going to take off 3,000. Okay? Between 3% and 4.5%, it's going to stay at whatever it's at, or it's going to increase by 3,000 or increase by 6,000. Now, if I'm running liquid products on the Gen 3 or the Gen 2s, I can also make adjustments to my liquid rate based on organic matter. Okay? So if you turn that on, understand that's what's taking place. If I don't want to do that, you can simply click on it and turn it yellow and disable that. Okay? So that's setting up our population. So let's talk through a few other things. We mentioned when we back into the corner and take off, but we haven't mentioned about how we are going to do our adjustments or calibrate our clutch timings, okay? As long as I am in here, let's see if I can make this one go ahead. Switch my switch on. Okay, so we're trying to plant here. You can take your finger on your screen here and you can tap and hold down and you can manually swath off some sections. On the Gen 2 here, you click on swath control, turn off, and you go to manual section control, and you can turn on and off sections. But remember, when you do that, when you turn off sections like that, and you can see here it's shutting off, when you want to turn them back on again, you can simply tap on the screen and go back to auto swath and it'll bring them back on. Same thing here, you can click on swath automatic, and it brings them back on board. Don't forget, if you turn your sections back on again, to switch back to automatic. Otherwise, you're going to get to the headlands, and it's not going to clutch off the way you want it to. Okay? But let's make sure we get them clutching the timing on and off correctly. We're going to back up in both of these to the home page. And so to do our clutching calibration, we go into Setup on the Gen 2 or 1, and we go to Systems. And then over here, you've got Calibration. Okay? So under calibration, let's go through row flow first on the Gen 1 and Gen 2s over here. You see the swath calibration box. It's going to have this auto calibrate. You guys are going to want that off. If that is on, every time you cross a GPS line and it clutches, it's going to say, hey, based on what I know on the measurements, I think we should shut off now, and it's going to adjust those clutches. Okay? Once you make some digging and you make those adjustments, you want them to stick. So we're going to leave this auto calibration off. And so I'm going to go ahead and line this marker board, this field up again. Let's say that here's my headlands, and we're going to put a whopping 3 rows. We've got a big 3-row planer right now. And we're going to come out of the headlands. Okay, we're driving out of the headlands here. That was a really bad arrow. Okay, we're going out of the headlands, and let's say there's 9 inches that we turned on too soon. And then we come back into the headlands, and let's say we were 18 inches too late. Okay? So we always want to dig on, So one point before I get into this that we want to make sure, when we're going to do our calibration of our clutches like this, let's go back into our crop setup on both systems here. And we're going to calibrate our timings. We want to see what is our swath coverage pattern. Okay? So in our swath coverage pattern, what are we asking it to do? So in this, when we look at these examples here, when I get to the headland, how much space do I want between when I turn off and that first row? So when I go to do my measurements for fine tuning, I want to go to no offset. I want to, because then I know right where I'm going to park my butt when I'm going to dig for seed, right? Because I can easily measure from that point back and forth. Now once I'm done and I've got things calibrated, I can go back in here and I can set it for, say, half a row width. So if I'm a 30-inch row, that's going to leave me 15 inches. Or maybe I'm going to do a full row offset, right? That's going to give me a full 30 inches there. Or what percentage of a row do I want? Okay, so I'm a 30-inch row and I put in your 0.67, that's going to give me 20 inches between that first row and here. But when I'm going to offset when I'm going to do my measurements for calibration, I'm going to go to no offset. Now this side, if we're individual row, will be grayed out. But if I got at least 2 rows tied together, my 50-50 is going to split right in the middle of that section. If I go under plant, the very first row that hits a shut off, I might get a little triangle in here. Or over plant's going to be that all the last row has to touch that headland before it clutches off. Okay, same thing on the Gen 3, identical layout. Okay, if your individual row shut off again, this will be grayed out because every row is going to do exactly what you asked it to do. So before we went out and dug and started taking the measurements, we're going to go in our control plan here. We're going to set it for no offset. Again, once we put our measurements in, we can go back and change this. Okay? Now that that's done, let's go back into Systems, into Calibrate, and Auto Swath. And here's our start and our stop timing right here. So our start, it's a timing thing. Depends on what clutch you have. Do you have an air clutch with 6 dogs that are going to grab? Is it a 18-dog clutch? Is it a half-width disconnect that only has 3 dogs on it? That's going to change your timings, right? So when you go through and you do an average of where do we think their measurements are going to be, it says, hey, to start seeding sooner, increase the value. To start seeding later, decrease the value. Guess what? It's a timing thing. 5 miles an hour, 1/10 of a second is 8.8 inches. Now you can probably figure out why I chose 9 inches being off. We want to start 9 inches later. Means we want to decrease the value, so instead of 0.5, we're going to put in 0.4. Okay, that should take my 9 inches out. Now, my stop delay, I want to stop 18 inches sooner. So I want to increase the value. So instead of 0.5, I'll punch in 0.7. Okay? Now, even though we've made these changes, you want to go now make, in the next pass on the headlands, do this digging again to validate that, number one, we went the right direction, and that we've got things dialed in where we want. Now, it's still a good idea that partway through the season, we're still checking every once in a while, periodically, to make sure that we're still getting the clutching that we want to see happen, okay? All right. So that's roll flow. I'm going to switch this to V-drive now. And then I'll show you both on the Gen 2 and Gen 3. So we go to the same place. I backed all the way out now. I'm going to go setup. I'm going to go to systems. I'm going to go to calibrate. And here's my swath configuration. Now on the Gen 3, I'm going to back up. I'm going to go setup. I'm going to go to systems. And I'm going to go to seating. And right over here is my offsets. Now the first thing I'm going to say is with V-drive, because of how well we are with everything, if you're 19 and 18 inches off, I'm guessing we got some measurements off. Okay? Another thing that let's say that this is 9 inches off one way and 9 inches off the other way. It could be that we're just 9 inches off on our measurement, since it's the same direction both ways, right? We turned on 9 inches too soon, we turned off 9 inches too soon. I might just flat out be 9 inches too short on my measurement, okay? But if we say, nope, the measurements are right, I just want to fine tune it, you could simply go in here and you punch in the measurement. Because of V-drive, and it's all us, we understand it, and you can simply put in the measurements. So if we looked at this, we say, hey, we want to start 9 inches later. The later we decrease the value, so we'd go ahead and we'd punch in your -9. And of course, the way I adjusted it, we would also punch in a -9 on the stop time side. And we would do the same thing on the Gen 3. Okay? And that's going to help us calibrate our clutches. Again, we go ahead and we validate, and when that's all where we want it to be, then we know we've got that set in correctly. Okay? Let's see here. So that kind of wraps up most of that portion of the control side of things. Some other things just to talk through real quickly would be some screen layout options for you guys. And on the Gen 2 and Gen 1s, it's pretty simple. If you go ahead and hit the dash view button here, you can change what that menu dash is by choosing something over here on the bottom. If I want singulation, it just stays singulation here. If I wanted to go ahead and scroll between things, we got auto scroll, but I do have to make some adjustments in a little different spot. So I'm going to go home, we're going to go setup, and we're going to go systems. And underneath systems, we're going to go back to display. And underneath displays, we've got right over here, dashboard mini chart auto scroll. And this is where I get to choose what do I want to scroll across and how often. So I've got it set at 5 seconds, and here are the 5 pieces of information I've got. There's other ones you can turn on or off. Okay, I can turn it on here. We enable it. When I hit home, now every 5 seconds this is going to change. Unless it's clutching. If it's clutching, it's going to show me population as it clutches. But as soon as he's done clutching, it's going to go back to every 5 seconds switching to something else on the bottom here. On the Gen 3 to do that, currently I've got a liquid system showcasing here, so it's my starter. If I want this to change, I can click on this and it's going to show all the different bar graphs I can scroll through on the side here, such as down for singulation and such. But if I go back to home, it's still the starter that I had to begin with. If I want this to change, I have to click over on the right hand side, I need to click starter. And then at this point, I can go through and actually change and grab something else. So if I go ahead and click population, now population will be what's on the bottom here, and it'll be listed off to the side. If I want this, if I want the Gen 3 to scroll like I just showed you guys on the classic screens to do that, then I need to click into that population box, and up on top here you see the auto scroll disabled. Once you click there, here's my options, the 3 seconds, 5, 10, 15, and right now it's disabled. So if I enable it, now here are the 5 items I happen to have selected right now. So now when I go home, you'll actually see now every 5 seconds, you're gonna see that bottom, see how it just changed now? Now we're on population, give it 5 seconds, and now singulation, and it changes accordingly. Okay, so it's a little bit different layout in how we do that.